Extract from the 754th Contact Report of September 23, 2020. This is an unofficial, unauthorized translation and may contain errors.
Because they don't know any better. But what if I can address something and ask a question about information from my father's faith annals? I am interested in why you and my father in 1782 regarding analogy.
Please don't. I don't want to talk about that.
Sorry, I didn't know you.
I'm sorry too, but some things etc. from earlier times. It's just the way it is, because there are some things, well, I'm sure you understand.
Yes, I understand. Sorry, because I didn't know your memory would hit you this way. It was not my intention.
Of course, I know that. But I don't think it's important to disclose everything, including the judicial murder of Anna.
It is.
It's okay, but some things in my past. You know. But let's leave that. Don't let yourself be delayed.
Sorry, I didn't know you.
Really?
It's okay. We don't need to talk about it any further.
Is fine with me.
Sorry, Edward, then. Good. In the annals it is also written that you and my father together visited and talked to those heralds several times in your past times and were able to gain insights that are unknown to me. With regard to earthly religions and sects, as I read in my father's annals, you must have a more extensive knowledge of these facts than I know because you have never spoken to me about them. It is written in the annals that you and my father together visited and talked to those heralds several times in the past and were able to gain insights that are unknown to me. With regard to earthly religions and sects, as I read in my father's annals, you must have a more extensive knowledge of these facts than I know everything, because you have never spoken to me about this. However, what you two have experienced and learned, and what knowledge you were able to gain that are unknown to me, that would interest me, with regard to earthly religions and sects, as I read in my father's annals, you must have a more extensive knowledge of these facts than I know because you have never spoken to me about them.
Maybe, because I don't know what your knowledge is. On the other hand, you never asked me about it either.
You heard from the mouths of the herald themselves what the truth and their stories were, and I would like to know that and hear from you. Shameful, malicious and irresponsible falsifications were made from their teaching, which was uniformly the same for all of them, as my father noted, which I know very well myself, from which world religions arose, but I do not know any closer connections. Overall, however, I would like to know more about this, because I have not dealt with this topic particularly, so I have a certain knowledge of this, but not everything that interests me further, and only you can explain to me, because you are familiar with the have spoken to terminators themselves. I am particularly interested in what is decisive about Buddhism, of which my father wrote that it had been falsified in the same way as the doctrine of heralds, from which Christianity, Islam and Judaism emerged through enormous falsifications.
Correct, but to explain what I was told by heralds themselves, that would lead too far, so I will only go into a little detail on Buddhism, which obviously interests you most, but I also do a few of the other religions etc. can say, which should actually be generally known.
Religions and sectarianism, as these are given in the case of earth mankind, correspond to a diverse infectious, evil disaster.
You say exactly what Sfath said in the same words, namely,
various infectious calamities.
When I asked about the meaning, he explained that he was expressing everything that was primarily related to religious indoctrination and thus to belief in God. This is because belief in God, as the most dangerous and deadly poison, makes all peace, all humanity, all love, all compassion as well as all righteousness and harmony impossible, and completely destroys as well as the mental abilities and thus understanding, reason and the intelligence of people. The delusional belief in God, he explained, and I can remember this very well, impaired human free will to such an extent that even from childhood through a religious sectarian delusion of belief he was absolutely incapable of understanding the reality of reality and its truth in his delusional delusion capture. As a result, he said, I have experienced this in my life in dealing with countless people and learned that it really is, that pathological delusions make people largely incapable of grasping real reality and its truth and accepting it, if they are addicted to a belief. It does not matter whether this belief is delusional or related to something worldly or something else. My lifelong experiences and experiences in this regard have actually also proven that, just that it is as Sfath said, and also that as a rule man is so hopelessly addicted to his delusions of belief that his intelligence is completely blocked, which means he no longer has a chance to recognize reality and truth. This also results, as Sfath explained, that the delusional belief in God, like every other belief of man, stifles intellect and reason and thus also reduces his intelligence so blatantly that he wages wars for his delusional beliefs, exercises and spreads terror, in hatred of murder of other beliefs and commits manslaughter, tortures, raped, massacred pregnant women, babies, children and people in general, all pillaged, destroyed and destroyed. This while on the one hand goodness, love, peace and humanity are preached, on the other hand punishment, death, war, vengeance and ruin are blabbered. In addition, paradoxically and contradictingly, there is the cowardly fear of a punishment from God, which is deep in people who believe in God and has been preached in a deliberately indoctrinating and completely irresponsible manner by religious fanatics of all kinds. This is contrary to the fact that God stands by his believers, loves them, protects them and punishes and destroys their enemies, which leads to the fact that believers in God think they are entitled to punish fellow men among themselves for wrongdoing etc., as well as for dissent and all sorts of things that they, the believers, do not like and do not fit into the stuff. Therefore, from time immemorial, malicious, torturing and murderous criminal courts and armies were created to allegedly exercise justice in order to exert degenerate revenge through the death penalty and wars as well as through sheer terror. People of different faiths, enemies, adversaries, unsympathetic people, strangers, uncomfortable people and those who think differently, etc., were therefore murdered in early times out of hatred, lust for profit and belief in God, which has been preserved until today. Countless people have been and are exploited in the name of God, robbed of their belongings, driven out, fought or exterminated, etc. And this delusional belief in God prevails in the overpopulation that destroys the earth, all ecosystems, nature and its fauna and flora as well as the climate and with their rulers and with the politicians of all states, who as a result of their parties are usually always at odds with one another and have arguments. And the fact is that the majority of these rulers and the parties usually consist of believers in God, with parties being called sects in early times by the Latins, which is the name given to them but was then used for
school
or
teaching,
etc. When dealing with the sects, the problem of the comprehensibility of this far-reaching phenomenon arises. On the one hand, the term
sect
is actually known, because it is usually associated with a very clear idea. Consequently,
sect
represents a known phenomenon that should actually be known to all earthlings, but which it is not with regard to the understanding of the term, hence it needs to be explained. There are no generally officially or scientifically recognized definitions of the term, but it can still be explained in an understandable way, even if many false explanations and attempts can be found, as there are also numerous stupid sect
specialists,
which theologians call religious scholars. This, along with others who arrogantly and megalomaniacs cheer themselves up as a
specialist office for sectarian issues,
by massively overestimating their own sectarian opinion as a means of saving the world and earthly mankind, and failing to perceive that they themselves embody a sect group that is not just for the missioning with regard to anti-sectarianism tends, but is effectively strictly sectarian. For these would be anti-cultists. The phenomenon of
sect
proves to be difficult and impossible to grasp with regard to a conclusive, definitional struggle. Caught in their pathological anti-cultist belief, their thinking, acting and their fear of a possible punishment from God are exactly the same as the theologians, who are just as afflicted by it as the cultists. As a result, it is also evident with them, as in politics and in governments, that they disagree with one another and take absurd decisions, and these are just such that they are based on fear of divine punishments, which is logically denied by all believers in God delusions. But moths deep within them, and in threatening
clarifications
and
threatening good advice,
demonstrations as well as
well-intentioned
ordinances, decrees and possible laws are conceived and created in order to then, if necessary, set up violent security elites who use more vicious violence against sect believers and also against the populations themselves. Would this, the theologians RUSP, religious scholars, religious preachers, including the Pope, etc., and their
specialists
of their
specialist office for sect issues
get away, then they would behave in the same way as all other general mob, if they are rightly or wrongly quarrelsome, primitive, violent, or peaceful fights, sensibly and correctly against idiot, good and sensible or evil and incorrect governmental orders or organizes terror. It is exactly the same when governments create military associations, armies or terrorist units that use threats, combat, war or terrorism against their own peoples or against other states and peoples, often also in order to assist their own peoples or other countries as alleged aid providers. But in truth, in order to chastise them and bring them under control, to invade other states and bring them under the knuckle of the alleged
protective power.
Nowadays sects are judged or condemned as religious as well as philosophical, atheistic and worldview groups, tendencies and followers etc. And if this is discussed in more detail, then the term sect today primarily stands for a religious community that has split off from a mother religion. Today, however, every mother religion is called sect in particular, and its female and male followers as sectarians, as well as generally their believers, religious scholars, theologians of all kinds, as well as preachers and Christianity experts, Testament and Bible experts, Islam and Quran experts, religious representatives, religionists, religious leaders, bishops, clergy, pastors, monks, pastors, priests, rabbis, Tanakh experts, Talmud experts, clergy, chaplains, priests, pastors, priesthoods, shamans, people of God, temple people, mosque people, imams, synagogue pastors, priests, Lord servants and black coats, as they are all called. If the topic of sects, sectarians is addressed, which is increasingly the case, then there is always a serious problem, namely on the one hand because these terms usually do not simply refer to sects, sectarians as such addressed and understood, but an insulting attack on one person or on several people. This is because hardly anyone thinks about it and consequently does not know what is actually behind and in the use of such terms. If, for my part, I talk and rant about sectarianism and sectarianism, cult activities, the sectarianism of people who believe in God, and I want to and must clearly state this as an absolute fact, then I never attack a believing person as such, not even individually in his personality and not in relation to his character in any way. I consistently respect and accept the individual characteristics of each person, including all physical appearances, as well as the type of correct and correct behavior, as well as their
not sect-related
thought patterns and attitudes, emotions, values and individuality, the distinctive character traits and temperament, life experiences, as well as the psychological characteristics of each individual are taboo for me and never an object for attack and criticism, because for me each person is absolutely unassailable as an individual. What I attack, however, and rail about it, concerns on the one hand wrong, incorrect and thought, emotional and psychological behavior that is harmful and dangerous for people and the environment, including sectarianism and sectarianism, which as a rule has already been irresponsibly hammered into being irresponsible by parents etc., as a belief in God delusion, which is tantamount to a pathological disease, and this delusion of faith, which prevents people from perceiving and recognizing as well as from their experience of real reality and its truth, should be combated by every believing person in order to go consciously and openly into life and experience it as real reality and truth to act out. Basically it concerns with what I now in the interpretation and explanation of the term sect in relation to a main religion clarify mother religion, from which small or large groups have become independent and separate religious communities of people have formed, or are increasingly forming them, in order to provide effective facts. These function with their own new doctrines, modified from the main doctrine, which are often just as or even more aggressive, mendacious and indoctrinating than the main or unmother sects. Mainly, however, small split-off groups are referred to as sects, such as theirs and the main religions, respectively. Mother religions believers as sectarians. Basically, however, small and large groups are also referred to as sects in other areas, and in fact extremely malicious and reprehensible, in particular by so-called theologians, respectively, allegedly,
scholars
who pretend to be high-handed,
religious scholars.
In truth, however, these are actually absolutely stupid because they are unable to think about reality and truth due to a lack of understanding and reason, because they live in a delusional belief in God, as well as erroneous and confused arrogance, and think they have least any groupings and theirs to be allowed to curse people as sectarians if they are of other beliefs, other views, or against the entire sectarianism of the mother religions and their sects, etc. For certain of these, theologians, religious scholars, as well as alleged
Enlightenment groups
and
Enlightenment organizations
attached to sects, is already sufficient to insult other groups as blasphemy, infidels, deceivers and liars, as well as apostates, etc. If they oppose the influences and machinations of the religious sects of the mother religions and their own deny these split-off separated sects. As already said, the terms sect, sects, sectarians are used for different areas, such as all religious organizations and groups etc., whereby in this regard especially theologians of Christianity, so-called religious scholars, but especially so-called Christian sect representatives and
infosect departments
stand in the foreground, which not only insult religiously degenerate faith communities as sects, but also defame all small and larger associations and communities and slander them as sects that simply do not want to have anything to do with religion and sectarianism, as is the case with our figure, which is vilified as a sect by the
Postal Info Sect Zurich
and the Oberland theologians. But what is popularly referred to as sect, sects and sectarians. Although many of these abusive people basically belong as believers to one or the other guild, precisely such sects, I want to add some of these religious communities and groups, etc. once, whose people are attacked again and again, which is fundamentally wrong and infamous. Basically, everyone should believe what they want and should not be condemned, treated nastily, cursed or murdered for it, as has always happened since ancient times and is still practiced today. And this happens especially with Islam, in which people who are crazy about beliefs and other people who are crazy about belief race around the world and murder people of different beliefs, own family members, especially sisters, nieces, friends, etc. As I have seen myself. And in this regard, it is not just degenerate Islamists, but effectively simple but fanatically devout Muslims, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, relatives and friends who reach for knives, pistols, rifles, ropes, scarves and other things in order to condemn it delusional faith to murder innocent people. As I said, everyone should believe what they want, even if every belief in every respect is false and sheer nonsense and thus nonsense and reveals crazy confused stupidity. But that is exactly the reason that no one insults for his faith, endangered, attacked or murdered. Only belief, wrong thinking, wrong feelings and the misunderstanding of reality and its truth should be clarified, but not the person himself, because he must always remain taboo, even if his wrong thinking his delusional belief is attacked and objected to or has to be shouted at. He can very well be attacked with hard and clear words, but never the person who has become a believer in him. And again it has to be said, everyone believes what he wants to believe, in every case, because he alone is solely responsible for his wrong belief, for his sectarianism and sectarianism, and only that alone can and must be attacked and condemned, because every belief is false and damaging, causes disaster, creates discord and hatred, whereby wars and terror arise and murder and manslaughter are committed. But now I want to say and explain a lot about what I have learned about religions, sects, God, gods, goddesses, beliefs, sectarianism and belief groups, etc. First of all, I want to enumerate what is popularly called sects, whereby some believers often hatefully and murderously act against other believers of other religions and sects, as Christianity has done as a missionary since time immemorial, Islam and Judaism etc. From which, however, the original Hinduism is excluded, but for which I will explain a few more things when I come to talk about Hinduism. Through Christianity and its missionary work, which is still practiced worldwide today, millions of people were murdered, just as Christian missionary work continues to demand sacrifices from missionaries and missionaries in their
name of the Lord.
It happened in the same way with Islam, as with all other religions, sects and denominations, whereby nowadays the completely degenerate Islamism in particular is murdering people of different faiths and also those of the same faith, as is also done by cross-criminal Islamic laws, such as in Persia, Saudi Arabia and Egypt etc. This, whereby these murderous lies and criminal laws and all resulting murders, flogging, torture, blindness, mutilation and death penalty etc. are justified by the Sharia, and from this resp. There
totality of all religious and legal norms, mechanisms for norm finding and false, misleading interpretative rules of Islam,
and which are lying and slanderously attributed to Muhammad because he is supposed to have taught them. But what one outrageous, shameful and vicious lies, defamation of unscrupulous crime like clerks. Now, however, I want to name the individual religions, sects and denominations, etc., as they come to my mind, although I probably want to list some of their properties, at least as far as I know them.
1. Main religions RISP. Mother religions, which are said to have been deceitfully and falsely dictated by certain beliefs as supposedly dictated by a god. 2.
Sects faith communities, which is religious sects of the main RISP. Mother religions are split off, separate and as a rule create and practice their own doctrines of faith and rituals, namely in that essential new basic features are given as a new order for the implementation of mostly ceremonial and especially liturgical acts.
3. Atheism. This corresponds to a disbelief in a god or gods. The term atheism encompasses broad meanings, which on the one hand express an existence without faith in God, on the other hand also corresponding ways of life, including vehement justifications in this regard, which are also cited with corresponding terms such as antitheism and non-theism. In doing so, narrow and strong arguments and meanings are used that reject and defend any assertion of the gods, possibly also combative or with counter-evidence. 4. Deism shows a conception of religion according to which only reasons of reason count, but not the authority of a revelation that could serve to legitimize theological statements. The deistic ideas of God are all based on the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, who according to God created the world, but no longer exerts any influence on it. 5.
Theism as delusional belief is fixed on a doctrine in relation to a personal God who is aligned as the creator and ruler of the world, whereby this is monotheism defends the belief in only one God in such a way that he created everything and cherishes everything as well as care and control, consequently nothing happens without his will.
6. Christianity is a religion that today includes around 2-3 billion believers, around 31% of the world's population, although this in and of itself corresponds to a completely mendacious religion that claims to be monotheistic, but is a religion which is somehow based on polytheism, because Christianity not only has
God the Father,
but also a
Son of God,
RISP,
incarnate Son of God,
as well as a Holy Spirit equals God the Father, Jesus Christ, Holy Spirit, which corresponds to a Trinity, and this absurdity as such is also glorified by the believers, with the alleged
Son of God
being adored and worshipped in an even deeper form than his alleged Father,
God Father,
and the
Holy Spirit.
The whole of Christian faith does not correspond to monotheism, but to a form of tridivinity, respectively, Trinity and thus a polytheistic form, which, however, is due to the impossibility of thinking about it and thus due to the stupidity of Christian theologians, respectively, religious scholars and believers is neither recognized nor understood. The sheer stupidity of Christian theologians and believers, that is, the impossibility of using intellect and reason through thoughts and deliberations, does not allow real reality and its truth to recognize that a God-Son-Spirit Trinity is absolutely impossible. Even then, if there were divine miracles, the whole of such a Trinity, Trinity, which in Christian theology describes the imagined essential unity of God in three persons or hypostases,
God the Father, Son of God, Holy Spirit,
in three substances and lies as an indissoluble unity, is so absurd, nonsensical, crazy, confused and completely foolish that even the last monkey in the jungle would laugh to death at such a fantasy claim. But since theologians and those who believe in God are obviously not powerful in this regard, but very strongly impaired, due to their piety, which in this way also relates to their intellect and intelligence, because understanding and reason do not work. This is precisely what happens for these people with regard to the recognition and understanding of real reality and its truth, not only lost hops and malt, but also inaccessible the possibility of ever finding access to understanding, reason and the reality and truth of reality. And since this is undoubtedly so, the question no longer arises, why the believing overgrowth of the overpopulation on Earth has fallen into a delusional belief in God and has been ailing in terms of consciousness since time immemorial, peaceless, destructive, spreading hate and violent, waging murderous wars, waging terror, being contentious murders, kills and makes all evil rampant. This freely based on the
Holy Scriptures,
in particular the Bible and the Christian Testament, as well as the Islamic Quran, the Jewish
Bible,
Torah and the Zoroastrian Avesta, etc., in which a large number of such malevolences are more or less openly or hidden, who cry out for vengeance, punishment, murder and manslaughter, as these show from the
Holy
Bible, which I recently gathered for someone who wanted to talk about it, in order to show him what the supposed
dear
and
good
gods are, and above all the
love, merciful, good, just, peaceful,
and
indulgent
God of Christianity. The is really nothing more than a viciously depicted fantasy figure who knows nothing but punishment, vengeance, death and perdition and destruction, etc. I gave him the following biblical sayings that I began with: Deuteronomy 32 hours 35 minutes, where about that
love, good,
and
merciful,
vengeance, murder and manslaughter, as well as punishment and retribution of the threefold polytheistic Christian God, is written, "Do not avenge yourselves, my friends, but give room to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I want to repay, says the Lord."
Genesis 4:15.
And the Lord said to him, "That is why whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance."
Genesis 27:42. When Rebekah was told about such speeches by her older son Esau, she called for her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Here, your brother Esau is seeking vengeance against you and wants to kill you." Leviticus 26:25. And I will bring a sword upon you, which will take vengeance for breaking the covenant. And when you then withdraw to your cities, I will send the plague among you, and you will be given into the hands of the enemy. Numbers 31:2.
Avenge the children of Israel on the Midianites, that afterwards you may be gathered to your people.
Numbers 31:3. And Moses said thus to the people, "Prepare yourselves men among you for a campaign, that they may go against the Midianites, in order to carry out the vengeance of the Lord on the Midianites." Deuteronomy 32:35. Vengeance is mine, I want to repay. In due time her foot should slide, for the time of their misfortune is at hand, and what is to come upon them hurries to come. Deuteronomy 32:41.
When I have sharpened my flashing sword, and my hand reaches for judgment, then I will take vengeance on my adversaries and will repay those who hate me.
Deuteronomy 32:43. Praise, you nations, his people. For he avenges the blood of his servants. He takes vengeance on his oppressors and purges the land of his people. Joshua 10:13. The sun stood still and the moon stood still until the people took vengeance on their enemies. It is written in the book of the righteous. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hurry to set, for almost a whole day. Judges 9:24.
That the iniquity committed against the 70 sons of Jerubbaal may be avenged, and that he may bring their blood to their brother Abimelech, who murdered them, and to the citizens of Shechem, who had helped him murder his brothers. Let come.
Judges 15:7. Samson said to them, If you do such things, I will not rest until I have taken vengeance on you. Judges 16:28. Samson called on the Lord, and said, Lord, Lord, remember me, and strengthen me, God, this time, that I may take vengeance on the Philistines for both of my eyes. 1 Samuel 14:24.
And when the men of Israel were weary that day, Saul conjured up the people, saying, Cursed be every man who eats anything in the evening, that I may avenge myself on my enemies. All the people ate nothing.
1 Samuel 18:25. Saul said, So say to David, the king desires no morning gift, only 100 foreskins from the Philistines, to avenge the king's enemies. For Saul sought to cut David down by the hand of the Philistines. 1 Samuel 20:16. So shall Jonathan's name not be torn from the house of David, and may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. 2 Samuel 3:27.
When Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in a corner of the gate to talk to him in confidence, and stabbed him in the body that he died, in vengeance for his brother's blood. Asahel.
2 Samuel 4:8. And brought Esbel's head to David in Hebron, saying thus to the king, Here is the head of Esbel, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought after you, but the Lord has vengeance on Saul and his descendants this day on my lord the king. 2 Samuel 22:48.
The God who gives me vengeance and throws the nations under me.
2 Kings 9:7. And you shall smite the house of Ahab your lord, that I may avenge the blood of the prophets my servants, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord, which the hand of Jezebel has shed. Job 24:12. The dying groan from the cities. The souls of those slain cry out for vengeance. But God does not consider inconsistencies. Psalms 18:47. The God who gives me vengeance and compels the peoples under me. Psalms 18:48.
The God who gives me vengeance and compels the peoples under me.
Psalms 58:10. The righteous will rejoice when he sees such vengeance, and will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Psalms 58:11. The righteous shall rejoice when he sees such vengeance, and shall bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Psalm 79:10.
Why do you make the Gentiles say,
Where is their God now?
Let the vengeance of the blood of your servants, which has been shed, be made known among the Gentiles before our eyes.
Psalms 94:1.
Lord, God of vengeance, appear.
Psalms 149:7.
That they may take vengeance among the Gentiles, punishment among the peoples.
Proverbs 6:34. For the wrath of man is jealous, and does not spare in the time of vengeance. Proverbs 31:9.
Open your mouth, and judge, and avenge the poor and poor.
Isaiah 34:8. For this is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of vengeance to avenge Zion. Isaiah 35:4.
Say to the heartbroken, Be of good cheer. Do not be afraid. See, your God, He comes to vengeance. God, who repays, comes and will help you.
Isaiah 47:3.
Your nakedness shall be exposed, your shame shall be seen. I want to take revenge and not accept any intercession, speaks.
Isaiah 59:17.
For He puts on righteousness like armor, and puts a helmet of salvation on His head, and dresses for vengeance, and dresses with zeal as with a coat.
Isaiah 61:2.
To proclaim a gracious year from the Lord and a day of vengeance from our God, to comfort all who are sad.
Isaiah 63:4. For I have set myself a day of vengeance, the year to redeem mine has come. Jeremiah 11:20.
But you, O Lord of hosts, you righteous judge, who try your heart and your heart, let me see your vengeance on them, because I have commanded you my cause.
Jeremiah 15:15.
O Lord, remember me and take care of me and take revenge on my persecutors. Receive me and do not forgive your anger against them, because you know that I am reviled for your sake.
Jeremiah 20:10.
Yes, I have heard the hostile speech of many. Horror all around.
Show him.
N.
We want to display it.
Even all those with whom I have been friends are waiting for a misstep on my part.
Maybe he will let himself be betrayed that we should get over him and take revenge on him.
Jeremiah 20:12. And now, O Lord of hosts, who try the righteous, see the heart and the heart. Let me see your vengeance on them, because I have commanded you my cause. Jeremiah 46:10. For this is the day of the Lord God of hosts, a day of vengeance, that he will avenge himself on his enemies, when the sword will devour, and be full of their blood and drunk, for they must be sacrificed to the Lord Jehovah of hosts in the land near midnight by the water of the Euphrates.
Jeremiah 50:15.
Shout over them all over. It must surrender, its foundations have crumbled, its walls broken down, for this is the vengeance of the Lord. Take revenge on her, do as she did.
Jeremiah 50:28.
The fugitives and those who have escaped from the land of Babylon are heard shouting, that they may proclaim in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, the vengeance of his temple.
Jeremiah 51:6.
Flee from Babylon, that each of you may save his soul, that you may not perish in their iniquity. For this is the time of the vengeance of the Lord, who is a reward and will pay them.
Jeremiah 51:11.
Yes, sharpen your arrows and arm your shields. The Lord has raised the courage of kings and media, for his thoughts are against Babylon, that he should destroy her. For this is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple.
Jeremiah 51:36.
Therefore thus saith the Lord, verily, I will deal with your cause, and take vengeance for you. I want to dry up its stream and let its spring dry up.
Jeremiah 51:56.
For the troublemakers have come upon Babylon, their heroes are captured, their bows broken, for the Lord God of vengeance pays you.
Lamentations 3:60.
You see all their vengeance and all their thoughts against me.
Ezekiel 24:8.
In order to bring up anger, to take vengeance, I have put their shed blood on the bare rock, so that it should not be covered.
Ezekiel 25:14.
And I will avenge me on Edom through my people Israel, and they shall deal with Edom after my anger and wrath, that they may experience my vengeance, saith the Lord God.
Ezekiel 25:15.
Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, because the Philistines acted vengeance and with a contempt so rightly exercised vengeance from their hearts, intent on annihilation and endless enmity.
Ezekiel 25:17.
And I will take great vengeance on them, and will punish them with fury, that they should know that I am the Lord when I have vengeance on them.
Micah 5:14.
And I will take vengeance with anger and anger on all nations who will not obey.
Micah 5:15.
And I will take vengeance with wrath and anger on all nations who will not obey.
Luke 21:22.
For these are the days of vengeance, that all that is written may be fulfilled.
Acts 28:4.
When the people saw the beast hanging on his hand, they said to one another, This man must be a murderer, whom vengeance will not let live, although he has escaped like the sea.
Romans 12:19.
Do not avenge yourselves, my beloved, but give space to the wrath of God, for it is written,
Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord.
2 Corinthians 7:11.
See that you are divinely grieved. What diligence it has worked in you, plus responsibility, anger, fear, desire, zeal, vengeance, You have proven to yourself in every respect that you are pure in the matter.
2 Thessalonians 1:8.
And with flames of fire to give vengeance on those who do not know God, and on whom so do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Hebrews 10:30. For we know him who said these,
Vengeance is mine, I will repay.
and again,
The Lord will judge his people.
1 Peter 2:14.
Or the centurions, sent by him to vengeance on evildoers and to praise the upright.
So this is the Christian God, as he was already imagined by the pre-Hebrews around 4,500 years ago, whereby everything written in all religious books, be it Torah, Bible, Quran etc., all of which circulate as
holy books
among the believers, however never taught, brought or written by heralds and prophets, but only centuries after their death by some scribes. These all resorted to traditionally handed down legends, fairy tales, stories and doctrines, which over all times of centuries and even millennia were falsified, reinterpreted and interspersed with unparalleled falsehoods and stylized to the point of pure religious tirade of faith. And from this arose
holy,
tireless books of lies, which were brought to the people of the earth as
holy scriptures,
through which they fell into the bondage of faith lies and fantasized misleadings. And this excess of believers in God is being trimmed unrestrained and unscrupulous by all evil and violence, as mislead by the
holy scriptures,
as a malicious drug that all around hatred, strife, jealousy, deceit, lies and slander, murder, torture, injustice, manslaughter, death penalty, violence, rape, degeneration, child abuse, annihilation and destruction as well as war and terror are given and conveyed. And this through their
holy books,
which allegedly were brought to the earthlings and taught by heralds and prophets or alleged
divine messengers,
a
Son of God,
or other imbecile invented allegedly by
strange figures commissioned by God.
Completely insane, confused and feeble-minded heresies, which have been portrayed and preached pathologically stupid since time immemorial, which haunt the minds of believers in God, including those who believe in Christ, and that Christianity is lying as a monotheism religion one God religion, and the Christian God on the other hand is portrayed as kind, merciful and loving, but elsewhere as malicious, vengeful and war-inciting, etc. The believers do not think about it, because they too are hidden in their deepest character after vengeance, hatred, malice, war, violence, strife, terror and panting for retribution. As soon as an unloved louse crawls over their liver, even an inappropriate or hurtful word leads to quarrels, arguments, murder and manslaughter. The wealth of one's neighbor leads to envy and hatred, theft, deception and murder, just as a different skin color, a different belief leads to racial hatred and religious hatred, just as a person becomes an enemy if he only thinks differently. Well, while the reality and truth of the alleged monotheism as Trinity Trinity embodies nothing more than a lie and a deception in relation to a polytheistic Trinity, while on the other hand, as my excerpts prove the opposite of goodness, love and mercy, these high values are nonsensically ascribed to this fictional God monster. An effective fact that cannot be more effective, but which Christian theologians and Christian believers can neither recognize nor understand, and therefore cannot understand because they lack the necessary intelligence in this regard. But this is based on the fact that they cannot aim at their cognitive possibilities with regard to understanding and reason, cannot address them and consequently cannot use them. As a result, it follows that they are just in relation to facts that they are not logically unable to think logically and rethink it, simply unthinkingly accept them as given and true with roaring stupidity. And then they hammer this into their consciousness as belief until it is helplessly gnawed into their memory in such a way that it becomes uncontrollably a false reality and thus, so to speak, an imaginary delusion for which they are completely hopeless, helpless, are hopeless and lost with no prospect of salvation. They still think they are clever and are of the opinion how intelligent, knowledgeable and highly educated they are, while their intelligence, which they erroneously use the wrong term intelligence, which only corresponds to the intellect memory, is also only average, like any other normal person. That was what was on my stomach and what I had to say one day. What remains to be said now, however, is the continuation of some explanations regarding the sects.
7.
Islam risp. Islam is a verbal noun. Risp, a noun formed from a verb. Risp is a nominal word which, if I remember correctly, was formed from the Arabic verb
aslama
and means something like
surrender
or
surrender,
which actually means
surrender to Allah,
which also means surrender, devotion and submission can be understood. Islam, which comprises around 23% of the world's population, cultivates a confession of faith,
shahada,
which should be recited honestly and convincingly and thus testify to the feeling of belonging to Islam. This confession is spoken in the following form:
there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet.
In Arabic,
La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah.
In contrast to the Christian polytheistic Trinity risp, Trinity religion, Islam effectively corresponds to a monotheistic religion that was founded in the early 7th century after Jmanuel, Chr. in Arabia by the herald Muhammad. Islam is the second largest world religion after Christianity with over 1.8 billion believers. The
Holy Book
of Islam is the
Quran,
of which it is said that it contains revelations that Muhammad in 22 years from 610 and 632 after Jmanuel, Chr. God risp, Allah received. As has been customary since ancient times, these statements were only written down decades and even more than 100 years and more, as with the Bible and other
Holy Scriptures,
after the death of Muhammad as
traditions,
and repeated reinterpretations, ultimately with X times further additions, which Muhammad neither said nor misled, and in 114 chapters risp, composed surahs.
8.
Judaism corresponds to a religion whose
Holy Scripture
is the
Torah,
signposting, and consists of 5
books of Moses,
and in Christianity actually counts as the
Old Testament,
and is called
Tanakh
by the Jews. The term Torah also describes the Torah scroll, which, as far as I know, is a handwritten scroll made of parchment and is said to contain an unpunched Hebrew text from the Book of Moses. Unfortunately, I did not have much insight into the Jewish religion, but I know that in Jewish services, a Torah scroll after a certain cantillation risp is read in a kind of trilling singing manner. The Torah corresponds to the first part of the Tanakh, which is also known as the
Hebrew Bible,
consists of 5 books and is also called
Chamaskicham's Torah, 5/5 of the Torah.
In Judaism, the Talmud given next to it corresponds to an attempt to understand, reinterpret and adapt the various texts of the Jewish Bible to the centuries and millennia in which these writings were created. And, as in almost everything in Judaism, there are also 2 different Talmuds, one from Jerusalem and one from Jerusalem. Palestinian Talmud as well as a Babylonian, whereby these in their conclusions risp. Linguistic structures are different, but are identical in their structure.
9. Hinduism risp. Sanatana Dharma, Wikipedia note, Sanskrit. Sanatana Dharma equals the eternal law, is the Hindu way of worshipping nature, and it has more than 1 billion followers. This orientation is the third largest group in the world after Christianity and Islam and comprises around 16% of the world's population. Hinduism corresponds to a very diverse complex that has its origins in Asia and India and actually corresponds to an excessive worship of nature, which however has 3 main deities above all gods and goddesses, namely, Brahma, the creator god who is worshipped by the Hindus as the first being in the world, Vishnu, the second of the 3 main gods, who is considered to be the protector of humans, as he is also worshipped as the sustainer of the world, also called Narayana or Hari, god of justice, honesty and peace, Shiva, Wikipedia, Sanskrit, Shiva, CV, auspicious so. Shiva is one of the main gods of Hinduism. In Shaivism, believers consider him the most important manifestation of the Supreme. The feminine power of Shiva is Shakti, which is under other than his wife Parvati appears.
The origin of Hinduism was in Asia and India, and began around 30,000 years ago, and today it is scientifically referred to as enotheism and Samadhism, under which a special worship of a deity is understood, which for a short time out of an ethnically delimited world of gods selected. Actual and fundamental Hinduism knows no binding
holy book,
as well as no church, synagogue, chapel or mosque, etc., nor any general dogma, etc., but gods and goddesses that run into the millions and are practically innumerable. Even with the original Hinduism, however, there are other splits or sects in which everything is different. Consequently, they also have temples and practice various religious rituals. As the third largest world religion, I must call Hinduism for general understanding. This, Hinduism, is the most puzzling
religion
for earthly scientists, because there is no founding event, no founder or founders such as Abraham, Christ, Muhammad or Zoroaster etc. Because Hinduism developed for people more than 30,000 years ago from nature and its fauna and flora and has been preserved to this day with various changes. But then this worship of nature became in the course of time up to Mesopotamia spread to Mesopotamia, where it has been preserved as such for a long time, but later developed into a form of religion and belief through external influences. About 11,800 years ago there was a very fertile cultural landscape in the Middle East, where the 2 great river systems of the Euphrates and Tigris are still doing their good work today. Even then everything was together with Anatolia, the Levant, respectively. The countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Sunrise Rasp, the Orient, and the Indus Valley, which extends as far as the area of Balochistan in northern Pakistan and the northwest of India, a vast fertile area. Balochistan is a Pakistani province with the capital Quetta. My daughter Gilgame Shaw was born there in 1967. The area forms the eastern part of the Balochistan region, with the western part belonging to Persia, respectively. Iran belongs to where I crossed the national borders between Zahedan, Persia and Nokandi, Pakistan. Balochistan, as the largest province of Pakistan, has, as I know, an area of 347,190 square kilometers. The whole thing, however, which then emerged a long time ago, was that over the millennia everything developed into important cultural development centers of the ancient Orient, but this was with regard to the effective origin of the whole thing, where and how everything actually originated in India to this day is unknown to all religious researchers, as well as archaeologists and paleontologists etc. It is certain that sometime around 30,000 years ago in the area of Asia and thus also in India and the Indus Valley, so also in the area of today's India and Pakistan, a civilization flourished whose honor and dignity were oriented towards all of nature and its fauna and flora, and thus also towards all ecosystems. It did not correspond to a creed or religion, which, if you look closely, cannot actually be called a religion today, but rather as a worship of nature, whereby the individual natural phenomena, such as animals, plants and all living beings in general, are viewed and understood and with certain names as deities are viewed and worshipped as gods and goddesses. That was basically the forerunner of what preceded Hinduism today. This type of behavior of the Hindu with their adoration adoration, just the adoration of nature, corresponds to a respect for nature, its fauna and flora, all ecosystems, the earth and the universe, respectively, of the universe. And this happens in primitive Hinduism in that everything living is venerated, such as plants, animals and animals of all genera and species of self-moving living beings on land, in forests, floodplains, meadows, fields, moors, seas, fresh waters, mountains and caves, etc. According to today's earthly human assumption, the earthly species and species diversity of all life forms is estimated at 1.5 million, while the pledge Sfath spoke of an earthly species and species diversity of more than 2.34 million as early as the 1940s.
Excuse me if I interrupt your interesting statements, but I want to interfere because you spoke of 11,800 years before the present day, but withholding the fact that you were with my father in what was then Mesopotamia. I wanted to talk about this at the beginning of our conversation, because I read a short note about it from my father's annals, namely that you two stayed in the area at that time for 8 months and lived together with the people.
Wikipedia.
Note: about Hinduism. You can find the following on Wikipedia: Gods and goddesses in Hinduism. Everyone shows a special side of Brahman in Hinduism. There are countless gods and goddesses. They are called devas. Hindus believe that each of them contains the whole world soul, but only represents one of its properties in a very special way. The world soul is called Brahman. It pervades and unites the whole universe and everything in it according to the belief of the Hindus. Some Hindus also call them God. Brahman is also found in each of the millions of Hindu deities. Each of them represents one or more qualities of Brahman in particular. For example, happiness, beauty, education or energy. Some gods fulfill special wishes, others drive out evil, protect people or bring them many children or other wealth. Often their appearance already gives away their message. Some deities are colorful and look friendly, others wear skull decorations and a somber look. Still others have many arms, eyes, or even a trunk. Each of them conveys a very specific message and is celebrated with its own festival. All deities together complement each other and all of Brahman's characteristics are added together like pieces of a puzzle to a whole. Every Hindu worships their own favorite deities. Your characteristics play a particularly important role in his life. These gods and goddesses are particularly important to many Hindus because according to their beliefs, the following should be understood with regard to their deities. Brahma created the world, Vishnu maintains the world, Shiva dissolves the world at the end of time before it is created again, Krishna conveys divine truths, Lakshmi is the goddess of happiness and beauty, Sarasvati is the goddess of language and literature, Ganesha is the god of happiness with the elephant head. The difficulties start with the origins. When did Hinduism arise? Nobody can say for sure. A founding event or a sponsor is missing. What is certain is that sometime around 4,000 years ago in the Indus Valley, in the area of today's India and Pakistan, a civilization flourished whose religion was a forerunner of today's Hinduism. People worshipped animals, plants, a kind of mother goddess and other often multi-headed deities. The Aryans brought the warlike gods with them. This colorful pantheon of gods mixed around 1800 BC with the beliefs of a Central Asian nomadic people who had invaded northern India, the Aryans. The equestrian people brought warlike male gods with them, whose stories are told in the four Vedas. These ancient texts shape Hinduism to this day. They are the oldest but not the only religious scriptures of the Hindus.
Jains, Sikhs and Christian missionaries. Many other influences have shaped Hinduism since then. The natural beliefs of the Indian natives mixed with that of the Aryan invaders, as well as with Buddhism and Jainism, which also originated in India, left traces. Likewise the Muslims, who conquered large parts of India in the 16th and 17th centuries. In response to this, the religion of the Sikhs emerged, and finally the British came with Christian missionaries in tow. It was also the British who first introduced the concept of Hinduism as a religious denomination around 1830. Previously, Hindu was a collective term for followers of Indian, but non-Muslim faiths. The word originally comes from the Persians, who used it to describe the people who lived on the Indus River. 1. Several or thousands of gods. It is controversial to regard Hinduism, which consists of such diverse currents, as a single religion. Many Hindus see their religion more as a worldview. Among them there are those who believe in a pantheon of innumerable gods, others worship one supreme god among many or believe that all gods are manifestations of a single deity. Still others deny the existence of gods but believe in the divine in every living being. After all, three main directions of Hinduism can be identified: Shaivism, Vaishnavism and Shaktism. The first two currents focus on Shiva or Vishnu as the supreme god. Followers of Shaktism worship Shakti, the female elemental force of the universe, which manifests itself in one or more female deities. Shaktism is closely interwoven with Tantrism. When Hindus pray to Christ as different as the faiths in Hinduism are, each of them is tolerated, none is considered heretical. And what's more, even gods and saints of completely different religions sometimes find their way into the pantheon. Buddha, for example, is seen as the reincarnation of the god Vishnu. It is also not uncommon for Hindus to worship Christ or make pilgrimages to a Muslim shrine. Although there are extremists among Hindus, religious wars never started from Hindus. Despite all the differences, Hinduism is not arbitrary. There are certainly features that make it appear as a unified religion. The great importance of the rites and rituals, for example, which completely determine the everyday life of the Hindus. Belief in teachers, gurus, and ascetics, sadhus, and the idea of the cycle of rebirths of karma and redemption, moksha. Finally, the caste system is the most important social expression of Hinduism. Without missionary zeal, an estimated 900 million people today are followers of this mysterious, possibly oldest world religion. The Hindus never developed missionary zeal and so most of them still live in India. They also make up the majority of the population in Nepal and Bali. There are larger minorities in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Great Britain, among others. An estimated 90,000 Hindus live in Germany. Most of them are immigrants from South Asia, but there are also Germans who feel drawn to mysticism and philosophy, and perhaps also to the fact that Hinduism is fundamentally different. Followers of Hinduism, which is often perceived as polytheistic abroad and categorized in circles, are called Hindus, whereby this hyperonym in its summary reflects more a European colonialist perspective than does justice to the historical development or the development lines of the different religions of India. In contrast to other religions, there is no founder of religion in Hinduism, Rather, the religious systems of India developed over a period of approximately 3,500 years. Hinduism therefore fundamentally unites different religions, some of which overlap with common traditions and influence one another, but show differences in holy scriptures, beliefs, the world of gods and rituals. Axel Michaels advocates the thesis that these different religions and communities mostly meet 5 criteria: a spatial reference to South Asia, b. similar social and marriage regulations, c. caste system, c. dominant Vedic Brahmanic values, d. the worship of certain deities, and e. an identifying habitus.
Yes, but I didn't really want to talk about that because then again antagonists.
You shouldn't take that into account. That wouldn't be your style either. Besides.
Okay, then it has to be. But I actually don't really want it.
It would be important, because what I know from my father's notes are so far only hints, but not yet the actual proper notes. That's why I'm particularly interested in what happened back then, because I don't know anything in detail about it, because you always keep quiet and only tell something when you are asked about it, or when it is about facts that do not concern yourself or that you are not forbidden to tell.
It's just not my way of telling things from my life that I actually keep to myself or that I only want to talk about in a close circle of trust when it seems appropriate to me. And for me this circle is just our core group.
That is no secret to me, but my opinion is that you should name certain facts in one thing or another, because this could explain in various ways what would be important for our Earth mankind to know, as well as false assumptions and assertions would take the sting out of falsehood or even lies and deceit. This, as just now, for example, with regard to the origin of Hinduism, which wants to be explained with wild, stupid and speculative hypotheses and which is also alleged to be absurd and earthly writings that do not correspond to the truth, as is the case with Buddhism, is what you should also clarify a few things about.
Good. Your word in my ear. And so, for once, I want to talk about what happened back then in Mesopotamia, with which I will not say anything further about Hinduism. But there are still some explanations about it on Wikipedia I will look for and find what I will add on this subject at the point where you interrupted me earlier in my remarks. But before I tell you something about what you want to hear and know, I want to clarify the following. What has led to alleged cultural encounters and experiences since time immemorial? These have actually never happened. But only this, that in the old early times, by which I mean 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, then unfortunately effective religions emerged, which as a rule were related to polytheism, whereby the religious worship of a multitude of deities, different gods and goddesses, but also nature spirits and people who were worshipped as deities, which is idiotically still done differently today. Most of the religions of antiquity, according to what for me goes back about 6,000 years through my experience, were polytheistic, whereby these beliefs had divine worlds that often emerged with figures from centuries-old traditions of originally lived people. In the course of time, however, these traditions were more and more often embellished with allegedly happenings, and fantasies were also invented, which were additionally embellished with constantly new additions to myths, and people were beamed up into saints. Consequently, the whole thing ultimately only corresponded to complete unrealities. This has also happened in the form of characters, in stone writings, stone images, sculptures and writings, and, which is now taken at face value by scientists and is no longer questioned, which often leads to scientifically
proved
claims that are not correspond to real reality and truth, such as the lies, deceit and slander regarding the alleged and never made statements and teachings of Emmanuel, Jesus, and Muhammad. Even facts of a purely historical nature that were recorded in writing, such as in chronicles, etc., are taken at face value by all genres of historians, religionists, philosophers and other so-called
scholars
and
scientists,
and are not questioned about their real truth. So it is not even taken into account that all the ancient characters, documents, sculptures and descriptions etc. that are still existing up to the present day, which are carved in stone, on animal skins, tree bark or papyrus etc., and which maybe far go back over the time of antiquity, were created by humans. This is from earthlings who have made everything according to their own understanding, evaluation and interpretation, and consequently recorded and produced a thing and facts in the way they interpreted, understood, imagined and corrected for themselves from their own personal point of view to have, and that has persisted up to the present day. Consequently it is still the case today and will remain so for all the future, which is proven today in every specialist book, in every newspaper article, in every TV and radio program and everywhere else every day leaves, because the personal touch of the earthling concerned is indispensably recorded in everything and everyone, and it becomes recognizable how this only applies to him. This also says what I believe is necessary to understand all of my statements, about which nothing more needs to be explained. But now to what you want to know.
Buddhism as today's teaching emerged from the original teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, which he called
the teaching,
spread,
the Dharma.
Although his original teaching was of a different kind than that presented by Buddhism today, the original doctrine was absolutely in opposition to Hinduism, Islam, Christianity and Judaism etc., as it does not correspond to any theistic religion or theistic sect. Consequently it is in no way oriented towards a centralization of the worship of an almighty God. But if I have to talk about Buddhism, then it requires longer and repeatedly repetitive explanations, because the whole thing is quite extensive, with excesses being inevitable for a more precise explanation. But listen to everything that needs to be said and discussed.
Buddhism as today's teaching emerged from the original teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, which he called
the teaching,
spread,
the Dharma.
Although his original teaching was of a different kind than that presented by modern Buddhism, the original doctrine was absolutely in opposition to Hinduism, Islam, Christianity and Judaism etc., as it does not correspond to any theistic religion or theistic sect. Consequently it is in no way oriented towards a centralization of the worship of an almighty God. But if I have to talk about Buddhism, then it requires longer and repeatedly repetitive explanations, because the whole thing is quite extensive, with excesses being inevitable for a more precise explanation. But listen to what has to be said and explained about this. In its original form, the teaching was neither a belief, a religion nor a philosophy, let alone a sect, because in truth the original teaching was a valuable guide, the many people reliable ways offered to find oneself, to control oneself in all imaginable things and to make true independent people of themselves who could also help themselves, liberate themselves from bad life camps and build them up. It was a primal doctrine that showed reliable ways through which willing people, if they followed the doctrine, found inner and outer peace and did everything to free themselves from all external misery and to become true people through their own efforts. So at that time the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama was about this, as it is today with the
spiritual teaching, teaching of truth, teaching of creative energy, teaching of life.
What the Pledgerin Cladina Akrina called the
silent revolution of truth.
At the age of 11, to promote and mature a consciousness development in people, so that they could build and use themselves and their own true abilities as well as help themselves. The teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, called
Buddha
by the population, was based on this, whose life story, teaching and work, etc., were completely falsified during his lifetime by antagonists, know-it-alls, misinterpretations and sect founders, only to be falsified even further after his death, which also resulted in splintering of the original doctrine, which can be described as Buddhism sects, because with these the basic original doctrine of Siddhartha Gautama has been thoroughly changed and falsified, up to and including hatred against fellow men and people of different faiths, that this resulted in persecution, displacement, murder, manslaughter, massacre, destruction and war. The best proof of this can be found today in Burma, where the Islamophobic, radical, Burmese Buddhist sect of the monk Ashin Wairtho in Myanmar is tyrannizing the large Islamic people and driving them out of the country by the military, whereby murder and manslaughter are also commonplace. On the other hand, along with other degenerate Buddhist groups, Lamaism in Tibet should also be mentioned, as well as the form of Buddhism widespread in Mongolian and Manchu Tungus cultures, as well as in Bhutan, Sikkim and Ladakh. If only the Buddhist sectarianism of Lamaism in Tibet is examined, then it reveals just as evil as in Myanmar, because what the Lamas and Panchen Lamas have done there, Siddhartha Gautama would chase his hat off and he would feel disgusted, turn shame and pain around in the grave. Wikipedia note: Panchen Lama is the title of an important reincarnation line of the Gelug order in Tibetan Buddhism. The Panchen Lama is considered the second highest Dralku of the Gelugpa and traditionally the emanation of the Buddha of immeasurable light Amitabha. If I were to describe the atrocities of Lamaism in Tibet alone, I would have to write several books about it. But I can recommend a book that shows some of what has become of Buddhist sects that practice completely false teachings of Buddhism that are absolutely not real, have a closer connection to the original teaching of Siddhartha Gautama. In order to gain a really clear insight into the Buddhist sectarianism of yesterday and today, especially Lamaism and its Panchen Lama, as well as the equally mendacious Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso. Note: today's Dalai Lama, who is particularly adored by women, although he despises them abysmally and hates, why might? The book
Der Schatten des Dalai Lama
by Victor and Victoria Tremonti, Patmos Verlag, Dusseldorf is to be recommended. The real life and work of Siddhartha Gautama was effectively a lot different from what is known today through completely false, lying and slanderous
traditions.
He led a life in which meditation played a very important role for him, through which he always gained peace and harmony, but many things were different from what was supposedly passed down, because he explained and told very many things in a completely different way than they falsified explain
traditions
before and since his death, just as it is also the case with Jmanuel, Chr. and Muhammad, whose teachings and work etc. over the course of time and already during their lifetime and especially long after their deaths falsified profoundly and denied statements in their mouths, fantasized, awarded and made
holy books
out of them, which are so full of ash-gray lies and slander that they cannot be surpassed with the greatest effort. When asked about certain alleged
true traditions
that circulated in the 20th century, which were read to him, Siddhartha Gautama explained that a large part did not correspond to the truth, such as that for him from birth neither his life, his wisdom and specialty was prophesied. His family still held a royal position. His family is not royal, but just a small noble family and the father a minor ruler of the Shakya area. His own family consisted of his wife Yasodhara, a lowly noblewoman, his son Rahula, as well as 4 daughters named Hasada, Abhaya, Jnana and Gautama, all of whom he loved and respected, although girls and women were inferior in his time and actually only considered and treated as bad and worthless goods. This, he said, corresponds to an unparalleled abomination and contradicts the entire vast beliefs of Hinduism, which is prevalent everywhere, which he cannot get over, because he regards both human sexes equally, whereby he respects the feminine a little more because it brings life and is life-sustaining. Without this, life could not give birth and exist. Well, the fact is, the 4 daughters of Siddhartha Gautama were and still are not mentioned in any traditions, for which Siddhartha justified that they were probably kept secret by the scribes of the
traditions,
who wrote about him and his life, because they were young girls and women were disregarded and not valued in his time, but often abducted and imprisoned in
Vaishyavasa,
note brothels, and sooner or later murdered.
But as it was then in Nepal and India, it is still today, as I myself have seen for a long time in India and Nepal. Siddhartha often left his family for days or weeks and for 28 years wandered again and again like an ascetic through the country as a teacher, teaching people, teaching them to find and understand his meditation method and the meaning of life, as well as that there was none God would help because there was none. Consequently they would only help themselves and would have to free themselves from all diseases, suffering, strokes of fate and from all evil and calamity. So he was not on the road as an ascetic for so long, had not left his family as it is wrong. How, according to his declaration, he did not use the teachings of other wise and experienced people, but only his own knowledge, experiences and personal experience which he made clear and unambiguous. This, as he also said clearly and unequivocally, that he only practiced his own meditation and went his own way in relation to everything and everything and sought and evaluated the truth of all things himself and gained in-depth knowledge and a far-reaching understanding of all things from it. He alone found and recognized the connections between all necessary things in life and made himself a knower and wise man. As a result, he became internally free from desires and the desire to be more than his fellow men. Therefore it was not convenient for him and embarrassed when he was always shown great admiration and devotion from people from different walks of life and he was called a person with great enlightenment. On the other hand, he had very often had to refuse, as he explained, embarrassed, but his entire defensive stance had never borne fruit and he could no longer get rid of his reputation as
Buddha,
which he was embarrassed to do, and he would be grateful if he could give up this reputation. In addition, he must constantly refuse to create a large community that should expand his teaching as a basis, because that is not in his mind. He probably had a few faithful of both sexes who were constantly around him and who would look after many followers of his teaching, but he did not want to do anything further in this direction, but keep the whole thing as an open learning community, because otherwise a movement of believers, note, belief organization or religion, would arise from it, which does not correspond to its purpose. Note, which unfortunately could not be prevented, as with Jmanuel and Muhammad. So Siddhartha did not establish a religious community, as is falsely claimed, because he held his speeches openly and without a religious organization with individual people or small groups. Consequently, in this way he was also able to win over people from different social classes, from which something like a traditional teaching school developed, which for many became a
teaching of life,
as is also shown by figure with their
teaching of truth, teaching of creative energy, doctrine of life.
Results. However, the whole thing aroused envious people, enemies and evil adversaries even during his lifetime, who insulted him as a liar and deceiver, falsified the doctrine, cursed Siddhartha and used it as a conspiracy theory to make his teaching impossible. This, while advocates and know-it-alls already glorified his entire work and his person during his lifetime and especially after his death, or falsely reinterpreted his original doctrine at their own discretion and understanding. As the last exemplification proves, the falsified work of interpretation of lies, which today is distributed worldwide beyond Siddhartha and all truth facts and as a work of lies and slander to all Buddhists as a genuine original teaching of Buddha or Dharma is foisted. In the course of time the original doctrine of Siddhartha Gautama, note Buddha, was completely changed and no longer corresponds to the original doctrine, because this was mixed very strongly with other and also religious and sectarian false doctrines, customs and rites etc. and especially with those that were indigenous as religions in China, Tibet and Japan and are mostly still today. As far as the teaching of Siddhartha is concerned, I must also mention that this corresponds to a way of life that has various principles, one of which, for example, clearly states that among all people there is a non-violence Ahimsa should prevail. This non-violence also originally prevailed in Hinduism and Jainism and was also included in his teaching by Siddhartha, and he did this, as he explained, which was completely correct, and which is also fundamentally represented and taught by our figure with their
teaching of truth, teaching of creative energy, teaching of life.
Because he saw how people and all living beings were badly and violently mistreated by the rulers and the people against the rules of Hinduism and Jainism, and consequently people were also killed by all kinds of incidents. And this also happened with regard to many other living beings who were killed senselessly and only for pleasure, etc. And this was the reason for him to include an ethical to perform an action and behavior that distinguishes between good and evil, which is essential and must be followed in order to be a just and true person. And in this important rule to be observed and also to be fulfilled by people, Siddhartha emphasized expressly, which I still remember well, it is also included that a very special attention and mindfulness is to be paid with regard to all values, in order to exercise responsibility, integrity and sustainability in terms of the necessary respect. This is the only way to guarantee justice, transparency and the cooperative coexistence of people, and thus especially the shared responsibility for general group-related as well as public and social concerns and needs etc. The whole thing is completely and unavoidably important, because only then can the functioning of all ecosystems, the planet, nature and all their living beings of all kinds and species of fauna and flora be guaranteed. Only ethical action makes the functioning of all living things possible, but it requires compassion, attention and mindfulness, good moral discipline as well as inclination, participation, consideration and familiarity, esteem and respect for people, as well as for everything that exists. The non-violence Ahimsa teaching, as it was interpreted and taught by Siddhartha Gautama in his original teaching, but as it is also taught in figure through their
teaching of truth, teaching of creative energy, teaching of life,
is geared towards this, that there should be no infliction of suffering or coercion, as well as no pain and no violence at all against any form of life, neither against humans nor animals or other living beings. Violence in the form of suffering, coercion and pain should not happen to people through punishments such as torture, chastisement or death, as well as not in the natural world of fauna and flora, such as hunting, fish, animals, and catching birds etc., as well as not by destroying, annihilating and exterminating fauna and flora life forms. This doctrine of non-violence was already held in this way in the first unwritten Hindu behaviors, which was spread, taught and followed by people as far as Mesopotamia, before a change made everything fall apart, when this principle was less and less observed and was ultimately forgotten. Also with the Buddhists this vow of non-violence Ahimsa vows in modern times, long before modern times, which began in 1844, are only theory, because for many of today's Buddhists all over the world, obeying the rule of non-violating is for people, animals, beasts and other everything living beings of all genera and species are no longer an obligation, but a voluntary act. So this age-old rule is broken today and no longer obeyed, as is the rule that neither injustice nor hatred or jealousy should be done, wars should not be waged, nor terror and violence should be carried out or bad thoughts should be harbored towards other people, but neither should people be insulted nor maligned by lies, slander or conspiracies or spoken badly about them. The original doctrine of Siddhartha Gautama not only differs significantly from today's Buddhism, but also from the major religions of faith Christianity, Islam, Hinduism and Judaism, as well as from all other global gods, both small and large. But even today's still acceptable Buddhism, which to some extent still corresponds to something as part of the original doctrine of Siddhartha and neither to a religious doctrine nor sectarian doctrine, can still be accepted even halfway, because it does not correspond to any divine error, value theory, philosophy or any similar brainless faith-based teaching buildings. As a result, the absolutely true original doctrine from which Buddhism emerged is in its effective origin, just as Siddhartha created and taught it, not a matter of faith or doctrine of faith, but a
doctrine of the right way of life, doctrine of self-knowledge, doctrine of experience,
and
doctrine of self-development,
with the aim of mental evolution and the use of understanding, reason and the correct management of life in every relationship. Note: Siddhartha Gautama was born in Lumbini in Nepal in 563 BC as a Hindu, whose biological mother Maya, note, who is called Jayatulma in Tibet, but elsewhere also Mayadevi and Mahamaya, and the biological father of the regent Shuddhadana Gautama was. Siddhartha himself was married to Yasodhara and had a son with her whom they named Rahula. Siddhartha Gautama died at the age of 80 in 483 BC in Jmanuel, Chr, in Kushinagar, India. As Siddhartha himself said, when he was 63 years old, he already recognized a tremendous amount of misery through his observations as a 14-year-old boy, as under many other things, that very many people in all areas suffered from various diseases as well as loneliness or bad strokes of fate, lived and starved in abject poverty, which everyone could only cope with difficulty. He further said that he had also observed how contrary to this the healthy, well-nourished and wealthy rich exploited the common people against all humanity, kept many people as serfs, abused them and completely indifferent to all events, health problems, disease problems, hunger and the general unworthiness of life. The rich and otherwise wealthy were very spoiled people who were afflicted by discontent, hatred, envy or greed, as well as vice, addictions and lust for pleasure. Just as many are said to have been completely afflicted by ruthlessness and unscrupulousness towards the common people, only allowed and done the very best for themselves and absolutely only brought and spread mischief for their fellow men. Everything Siddhartha said in this regard was actually the case and lasted for a long time before there were minor improvements, which only came about as a result of parts of the population following his teaching, which he worked out in 7 years and at the age of it began to spread for 21 years after he got himself up and learned a lot through his own strength and use of intellect and reason. His newly created teaching then led to better living conditions for many people who became his followers, as he said, while others, however, who did not care about his teaching, often deteriorated more and more, rotten and in slums eke out a miserable existence. Siddhartha stated that he had learned to teach and control himself by being deeply absorbed in meditative thoughts, through which he found the way to himself, which he then, as a result of being with his followers, Buddha,
called his teaching as the
Buddhist way. In this way and through his meditation he was able to find himself and his way, to free himself from all suffering, as well as to work out and create his teaching, through which he could also expand the possibility of it, including that to be able to show people the way to a better life in the same way, so that they too can recognize themselves and their own strength and ability, find their way out of their suffering and lead a normal life again. At least that was his speech, according to which he lived and led a modest life, in which he also met his fellow men with honest devotion, pleased them, treated everyone equally and did them good, without them in any way with regard to their religion, belief, appearance, to evaluate, despise or treat social class, their morality or behavior etc. differently from everyone else. The work and behavior of Siddhartha Gautama led him to further knowledge of many things, which, according to old beliefs and words, as I already mentioned, from the population,
Buddha
was called
the Enlightened One.
Siddhartha Gautama also said that he instructed people in detail about many things, passed on his knowledge and experiences without asking for anything in return and taught them his teachings so that they could develop themselves personally and individually, help themselves and free themselves from their suffering and lead a life worth living. Thankfully, however, he received everything that he needed for a living from his followers voluntarily and without demand, although he did not need it because he always had enough to live on from home. That was around 2,500 years ago, from which then, because Siddhartha, as I said, was called
Buddha
by the population, precisely,
Buddhism
arose, to which it deliberately did not contribute, but unsuccessfully refused, as he explained. But what Siddhartha said and explained about the alleged
unadulterated
traditions up to the modern age of the 20th century, corresponds to all known and alleged facts about his teaching and his life to nothing but lies, deceit and slander. The greater part of all alleged
traditions
actually correspond to untruths which, as Siddhartha himself expressed, an
unforgivable shamefulness.
This, as also Jmanuel, Chr. and Muhammad stated in a similar way to everything that fabricated from their teaching through lies, falsifications, deceit, malice, misunderstanding and fanaticism etc. and led to a religion of delusion. Siddhartha Gautama was completely shaken when he learned what would result from his original doctrine in the future of the 19th century, but after he had learned the truth and also the day of his death, he made up his mind during the last 17 years of his life even more and more vehemently for his teaching, in order to be able to prevent something disadvantageous. And just as it is with the people of the earth, so it was with Siddhartha, because he did not want to accept what was to come and held on to his opinion that through his increased and more powerful commitment to spreading his teaching he would still have some or even everything can change for the better and for the better. This although he said frankly, after he had learned the facts of the future, that he had experienced it himself in his life and knew that in his lifetime there were falsifications of his teaching in circulation and groups of beliefs that completely reflected his true teaching wrong, changed form and even evil is spread through teaching. Therefore, he can also understand, if in the future so-called
true
traditions would also apply to him and his teaching in the worst way, that these will no longer be more falsified than all the worst delusions. Buddhism, which was first spread in Asia, in the Indus Valley and in Mesopotamia and then also in other countries, found widespread supporters, and it continues to this day all over the world. Consequently, it is also considered the fourth largest religion in the present day, although it is not such. As already explained, Buddhism originally had nothing to do with religion and sects, which is why today, although it has little in common with the original doctrine of Siddhartha Gautama, it is wrongly named as a religion, although it is, as with original Hinduism, was not a matter of faith and therefore not a religion or sect, but a
teaching of the correct way of life.
But that has already changed some time ago, which is the work of all the know-it-alls of the sign religious studies. As I already mentioned and I repeat again, because it has to be said clearly, it is unfortunately common among earthlings that in Buddhism, too, through know-it-all elements, splits and thus sects have emerged, which differ from one another in views and opinions, and consequently accordingly also represent different teaching views etc. The true doctrine that Siddhartha Gautama taught was, as already explained, in contrast to the great divine and delusional belief organizations Hinduism, Islam, Christianity and Judaism, not a theistic religion, and consequently it is in no way aimed at a centralization of a worship aligned with an almighty God. This already differs from Siddhartha's original doctrine, from which Buddhism emerged, significantly from the major religions of faith, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism and Judaism, as well as from all other worldwide small and large religions and gods. The falsified Buddha doctrine circulating today, which Siddhartha did not teach in the wrongly traditional way of today, corresponds neither to a religious doctrine nor to a sectarian doctrine, nor to a doctrine of philosophy or any similar doctrinal buildings based on faith. The true original doctrine in its effective origin, as Siddhartha created and taught it, was not a matter of faith, as must be clearly stated and emphasized again and again, but a
doctrine of the correct way of life, doctrine of self-experience,
and
doctrine self-discovery,
with the aim of personal development of the cognitive abilities for the use of intellect, reason as well as self-recognition and correct coping with life, in every life-correct relationship. Everything people think and do creates good or bad effects. Men simply has to come to enlightenment in order to gain the right insight in this regard and thereby to live essentially in real reality and its truth, however always to make the right decision, to choose the right word, to give the right speech and to give the right answer. Not to lie and not to hurt others with wrong words. Observe the right action at all times. Be honest and honorable and worthy. Do not steal. Do not cheat. Do not defame and do not kill, as well as in all ways to pursue a correct livelihood, not to harm other living beings, but to do good, and how in other words, to strive for enlightenment correctly. To draw the necessary attention and mindfulness to thoughts and feelings, all this corresponds to the correct collection of many necessary values that should always be kept present through meditation. The essence of the original doctrine of Siddhartha Gautama is based on profound thought work in relation to meditation in mindfulness and attention to the properties of inner peace, as well as to harmony, righteousness and respect for life, love, justice, being human and wisdom summarize. However, what Siddhartha did not consider in his meditation method and since then has not been taught in any Buddhist meditation teachings or elsewhere in other foreign teachings or their further values are mentioned, that is the mother of all meditations, which forms the main factor of all learning, namely the actual meditation base factor. Basic meditation factor, permanent state day meditation, day waking awareness meditation, in addition to what is given to the whole of the entire meditation practice with regard to meditation and its various methods. This relates to the daily, conscious and unconscious, not subconscious, permanent state day meditation, which is all other meditations precedes, but has been unknown in all earthly meditation teachings since ancient times, as a result of which it was never taught and not spread. The permanent state daily meditation corresponds to a daytime waking consciousness meditation, which takes place during the whole time of the day in the daytime waking consciousness, which takes place in lying, sitting, standing, walking as well as during movement and every activity, both in a conscious and unconscious manner, whereby the
unconscious way
corresponds to a level superior to consciousness which has nothing to do with the subconscious but corresponds to a recording, editing, processing, switching, changing, reproduction level. Fundamentally, the first and most important step of meditation is the daily mindfulness attention continuous meditation with regard to the constant state daily meditation in the daytime waking consciousness. Not only is this particularly important to note, it is the most important meditation of all. This is because it results in the conscious and controlled cultivation of the constantly resulting thoughts and the resulting feelings, which deal concentratively with everything and everyone, what is currently being thought, feelings created, what has been done, spoken, executed and handled, and what behaviors etc. are carried out through the continuous state day meditation of daytime waking consciousness, provided that this meditation is practiced willingly and consciously. Everything and everything is consciously and unconsciously thoroughly controlled, whereby everything that is done, acted, said and handled is carried out completely or at least largely correctly and without errors. Becomes, if in the course of the day or after the day's work the constant state daily meditation in daytime waking consciousness for a state of rest, or if a calm meditation is interrupted, a thought stop is necessary, whereby a lingering in a meditation on calm can take place. With all that has been said, it should be enough, because I have a few other things that I should also bring up.
Thank you. Your information is very insightful and should be enough for today. So if you have other things to talk about, then...
Okay, thank you. Then I want to say something again about the Corona Epidemic, about which I wrote predictions in the 1940s and 1950s and sent them to newspapers, governments and various organizations around the world, with Pastor Zimmerman, Professor Gustav Jung and my two teachers Graf and Lehman me have supported tremendously.
Yes, yesterday I read something new about it in my father's notes, with a few short notes also mentioning the Hinterschmudruti farm, as well as the existence of the core group, and that on the one hand the number of members was
reduced
for a long time and a purification would also result. The connection is somewhat clear to me, but the notes also referred to mortgages and the structure of the farm, to
monetary economy,
an exemption from debts and a
wreath epidemic.
But what it is all about, I don't know yet, because I only skimmed 2 or 3 small notes that point to a longer description in the annals, which are supposed to contain long and detailed records, but which I have not yet been able to look for, so I don't know what it is really about.
Maybe it's about the fact that I saw the whole of the future together with Sfath and therefore just knew what was to come, so I could act on it.
But what could
freedom from debt
and
wreath plague
mean?
What you found and read some notes about, that could perhaps be that which relates to our center and the bells and whistles of buying the Hinterschmudruti, their structure, management and the related financial issues, and also the mortgages, so on, money that had to be borrowed from the bank in order to be able to buy the farm. It can also have something to do with, because I knew that the Corona Epidemic and a few other things were coming, that I had to sort everything out before the
reduction
of members on the one hand, and the work stop on the other hand, came, and the epidemic blocked everything. If the figure had hit any debts and also mortgages, then we would not have been able to pay for them financially, because then the necessary income would have been missing. That with their
money work heaven
and their
debt freedom
could have something to do with the fact that the mortgages were cancelled and the Hinduism Resp. The center and the whole of the figure association with all the trimmings had to become absolutely debt-free in order to be able to financially survive the emerging worldwide epidemic crisis. That meant that the whole thing had to be done before there was a reduction in the number of KG members, the work abroad was precarious and the income decreased, because of the fact that the mortgage obligations also resulted in such a way that they could be triggered at the banks, as well as that no companies or otherwise never incurred debts, but invoices always directly on delivery or against prepayment of goods or after receipt of the invoice has been paid within 2 to 3 days at the latest. Figure has remained debt-free apart from the 2 mortgages, which could also be triggered. Consequently, neither payment obligations nor any financial difficulties, obligations or problems etc. exist in this or in any other relationship.
Your actions and work have borne good fruit, I have to say that. If I had to do such a job, I would fail.
Wouldn't be a me cool, because you don't know any money, so you couldn't handle such money and you would have to learn everything first, as I had to do, which I started as a little boy of about 5 years because we children had to earn our own pocket money during the World War, because our parents were not rich and had to be happy that the money they earned was enough to pay everything they needed and not to go into debt. Therefore, we children collected glass in the waste pits, which we could sell at the Bulak glassworks for 0.5 cents per kilo, while we sold the collected scrap metal to scrap metal dealers. Depending on the time of year, we would also gather wildflowers, tie bouquets from them and sell them to households, as we did with blackberries and wild strawberries. We also collected pine cones in the forest, which we sold in the Wage restaurant to Mr. Lub, who stored and dried them in the cellar, then used them to heat his inn when the weather was cold. But what should now be said regarding the term
wreath epidemic?
Sfath, your father, was of the opinion that the epidemic, precisely the Corona Epidemic, should have this name because as a pandemic it encompasses the whole earth and millions of the dead, for whom, according to earthly funeral custom, countless
funeral wreaths
would be placed on their graves. This in accordance with earthly Christian custom, because a wreath is a symbol of eternal life, infinity and hope. He also included Buddhism, because a wreath has the shape of the wheel, which in Buddhism as a sign symbolizes the integration of humans in the eternal cycle of life, death and rebirth. Sfath also told me that the whole thing regarding the interpretation of the wreath and the wheel in relation to the integration of the human being in the eternal cycle of life, death and rebirth is to be symbolized together with
wreath,
also as
crown.
And in this way, I think, the Corona Epidemic can also be openly named in German as
Kronenzug
instead of Latin
Corona.
That would be very possible, but as it always is, as I can find out again and again, instead of the German language, the Latin or ancient Greek language is always used, which means that the common people cannot understand what, for example, illnesses mean and what medicines are about tax. In this regard, there is an arrogance mania prevailing in the various earthly sciences, which is on the one hand unnecessary and on the other hand confusing for the common people. And just as confusing is the fact of the stupidity of those leaders who do not know what to do about the rampant corona pandemic, what to order and enforce among the population in order to put a stop to the epidemic. Speeches and empty demands, such as that the people should take their personal responsibility and put it into practice, are so stupid that they can effectively be talked about as ridiculous. But it also proves that such leaders who demand this from their people are doing their job are unworthy and incapable of taking the correct and necessary measures.
That will be so, to speak to the populations about their personal responsibility and to ask them to perceive, carry and fulfill their personal responsibility. That is pointless for a large part of the population, because this hangs around completely wrong in life and is blind to the reality of reality and its truth. Just as these people are delusional in God, so are they also delusional with regard to otherwise crazy delusional conspiracy theories, which they trust and emulate in their limitless stupidity. Consequently, they trample reality and truth underfoot. They do this by demonstrating an extremist terror and doing it like the degenerate neo-Nazi extremists they follow, but also in a similar way aping and imitating the stupid demonstrators of their
Fridays for Future,
who create terror for something and play crazy for something, of which they have no idea and do not know that it is exactly they who will continue to drive climate destruction in the future by driving up overpopulation through the fathering and giving birth of countless new earthlings. And this results from the machinations of the earthlings with regard to their needs. Consequently, they destroy nature, their fauna and flora, all ecosystems and furthermore the climate in order to meet them, because they produce endlessly all destructive greenhouse gases through their activities, which collapse the climate float. And this is what the stupid do so long until they possibly get themselves killed. Then I would now like to go back to the subject of conspiracy theories that have been circulating among the earthlings since time immemorial, but which have persisted over centuries and millennia. Like the conspiracy theories of religions and sects with their madness of belief that one God and not man himself is the master of his life and destiny etc. This has resulted in the army and military mania with the defense measures and the insane armaments, whereby every armament and armament a crime against humanity, against peace, harmony, humanity and righteousness as well as towards each and every human being. Armies and military, like everything warlike, arose from the fear and vengeance principle of the doctrine of God.
An eye for an eye,
And
a tooth for a tooth.
And this led to nothing other than war madness, strife, spreading fear, threats and warmongering prevail, with the US at the forefront, greedy for global power and viciously war criminals. And when I say and reveal all of this, then it is not I who is important, but what must be said according to the truth so that people should learn to know what is really going on in the world. This also means that the earthlings completely rob the planet without conscience, consequently one day it will be hollow, empty, dead, a complete ruin and absolutely lifeless, and the thinking of the earthlings becomes more and more hollow and empty, as well as their life responsibility and the attitude to life itself. Consequently they become more and more cowardly and catapult themselves out of existence and life when they fail and are too cowardly, their life with them to cope with all ups and downs. Consequently they then simply kill themselves, or in some way by their own murder with horrendous amounts of money and let themselves be murdered by some legalized forms of murder with their help, poison, etc. Because they are cowards of life, themselves are incapable of judgment and are completely irresponsible to life. The mighty overgrowth of earthly overpopulation earthlings has completely forgotten that clear thinking. The thoughts of truth announce the reality of reality, while thoughts of faith are the unreality of the unreal. And the overgrowth of overpopulation, above all their
Fridays for Future
freaks, is so stupid that it does not notice or understand that the destruction of the climate and all the destruction of all ecosystems, and all the destruction and extermination of nature and fauna and flora emerge solely from the machinations of the massive overpopulation. Consequently, this excess of humanity must be reduced enormously and drastically by a worldwide birth stop and by birth control. If I am harshly attacked in my statements with regard to those who believe in God, as well as when I speak of stupid earthlings etc., then in each individual case it must always and absolutely clearly be understood that I am not a person in his way, not in his honor and dignity, as well as in his person, not as man, nor in any other way or way in his freedom, not for his free will of his faith, in his personality or otherwise attacking people. What I attack relates solely to what is wrong and worthless from logical knowledge, as well as damaging the consciousness, as well as pathologically completely absurd irrational contradictory thoughts, feelings, beliefs, action and behavioral factors are concerned, nothing more and nothing less. Everything that I mention under
believers in God, delusional believers,
and
believers,
etc., or in relation to any other moments, factors, things and things etc., should, can and must never apply to a person as a person, as well as not be related and misunderstood directly to a person and not to personality etc. Basically not, because such an attack on a person and on his person and personality is absolutely not in my mind and also does not correspond to my nature. In any case, always and in every individual case, with every naming of a factor, regardless of how the form of speech is formulated as a result of the language, only that aspect, that basic element or that point of view addressed and meant which, as the basic effective factor, clearly and unambiguously represents the tiresome factor of aggressiveness. So if the belief in God itself is called as idiotic, feeble-minded, thoughtless or attacked in any other way, even if it seems, or wants to be misunderstood, that I am attacking people, as a person or their personality, then this does not correspond to the correctness, but either a misunderstanding due to a lack of intelligence, or flatly an evil and unjustified insult, etc. Finally, it must also be said that I am also not an old true prophet, teacher or herald such as Emmanuel, Buddha, Abraham, Confucius or Muhammad etc., as well as not attacking any founder of a religion or sect, neither as a person nor in his honor and dignity, nor as a person or in his personality. If I raise my voice attacking the founders of religions or sects, then it is not directed against the person, his person or personality, but only directed against his wrong actions, deeds and false teaching, as well as the spreading of faith. Real prophets, teachers or heralds, such as Emmanuel, falsely called Jesus, Buddha, Abraham and Muhammad, whose true teachings have unfortunately been viciously and slanderously falsified and remodeled into cult religions, are taboo and unassailable to me, like these true prophets, teachers or deniers, because they deserve all honor and dignity. Unfortunately, however, their true teaching has been misused and so falsified and mutilated that they have been used since ancient times for strife, hatred, revenge, retribution, torture, murder, war and terror, etc. In truth, their effective and true, correct teaching, which they brought and taught, was such that it corresponded to the honor and dignity as well as the inviolability of all creative laws that cannot be brought into harmony with an imaginary creator God.
You should put this entire statement at the front of the new forum as an introduction to the interview reports to be published on the internet from now on.
Actually a good idea that we should really implement, because then it is clear from the beginning how everything is to be understood. But I still have a few things to say about what I spoke about earlier. The religions have not only invented an imaginary god, but also an evil devil and Beelzebub, as well as a hell in which those who believe in God or those of other faiths are to be roasted and tormented, who, moreover, were hated, insulted and blasphemed by the believers during their lifetime and wished them death and the devil at their necks. And the dear believers in God also have the loving quality of taking vengeance on the unbelievers for anything and everything, if something does not suit them with them. And then the revengeful attacked non-believers defend themselves. Then this is interpreted by the believers as evil retribution, and a counter-retribution is immediately launched, according to the belief principle retribution against retribution. In this conspiracy theory, the belief in God has gotten so deeply into the preached religious mania for revenge,
eye for eye,
that it moths deeply anchored in the character of every believer in order to break through vehemently and viciously at the appropriate opportunity and into enmity, discord, hatred, murder and manslaughter, war and terror to degenerate. And this does not only arise in the private sphere of those who believe in God, because the nonsense of faith also moths in the whole of politics, but especially in the military system, which around the world in all countries is geared solely to murderous, destructive and completely degenerate defense measures in the form of war armament, whereby for a war one often begs for victory in the name of a foolishly imagined God by dog-like supplication. In my opinion, the religions and their sects are effectively the most vicious, worst and most powerful, as well as the most deviously hypocritical of all idiocy conspiracy theories, with which people are most addictive, extensive and the most dumbfounded, as well as the most dangerous, demented, evil and sinister conspiracy lies in the entire universe were invented. And through this crazy and pathologically mind-neglecting, feeble-minded, stupidity-promoting, all-round religious sectarian conspiracy candy, the entire catastrophically overpopulated planetary humanity of the Earth is endlessly enslaved under the degenerate spell of the all-dominating and every understanding and every reason-stifling delusion in God. And in this delusional belief in God, the entire religious sectarian believing earthlingness has been controlled from time immemorial by the nonsense impressed on the character that injustice should be repaid in a way of
an eye for an eye,
and
tooth for a tooth.
This traditional religious sectarian delusional belief in God, which is also interpreted as,
if you don't want to be my brother or sister, then I'll crack your head,
does not correspond to law, order or humanity. And since this is the case, there is also no ordering and exercising of an appropriately pronounced punishment, penance and liability, which should be humane and should be exercised, but only malicious vengeance and retribution. Just as in ancient times the religious sectarian delusion in God according to
an eye for an eye,
and
tooth for a tooth,
and thus vengeance and retribution was applied, so this has been cultivated since time immemorial among those who believe in God to this day and in the future. And this happens without the believers in God ever becoming conscious and clear, because the whole thing is deeply hidden in their character and does not penetrate into consciousness. Consequently, they cannot perceive and cannot realize their underlying tendency to revenge and retribution. As a result of this fact, it follows that the believers in God from their deepest character immediately become violent as soon as something comes to them that is against their meaning, will, their opinion or view, etc. Because those who are deeply mothballed in their character, vengeance and retaliatory impulses ignite and blaze up outwards in an uncontrollable manner. If the vengeance and retribution stimuli, which are deeply mothballed in the character, are immediately ignited by bad thoughts, feelings and psychological excitement, then the deepest negative evil character content is driven into an uncontrollable chaos within seconds. Hate, vengeance, retribution and with it violence united in itself, the whole thing flares up immediately and breaks through viciously to the outside, with words, movements and correspondingly violent actions that bring disaster, such as strife, war, terror, bondage, exploitation, crime, etc. The entire fact is the whole large part fault to the earthlings, who believes in God. Madness is infested with all evil in the deepest character being, but neither perceives nor knows this, because from time immemorial and up to now all there,
clever,
be it philosophers, wise men, professors, psychologists, people who know people, psychiatrists or otherwise knower, etc., would have ever been able to fathom, clarify, and point out these facts. Therefore, until today the people of the earth have never been shown what a delusional belief in God causes in every believer, what goes on through him in his deepest character and what malicious consequences result from it, which overall primarily only bring darkness of consciousness for every person who believes in God, but ultimately all evil, strife, violence, war, murder, manslaughter, annihilation and destruction. Through every religious sectarian belief in God, people in every respect are driven into the worst as well as most inhuman, most murderous forms and catastrophes, as it has been evoked from time immemorial in the most vicious and degenerate way as calamity upon calamity and bloodthirsty, bellicose, murderous as well hate-inducing eclipses everything vicious, but can get worse in the future. My long story short now relates to my short question. What do you think?
I cannot disagree with you on this, but I have to say that it has not occurred to me to include the religions and their sects in the conspiracy theories, but now that you have made the whole thing clear, with more frightening, realize clearly that your clarification corresponds to the effective and irrefutable reality, fact and truth. The fact that you recognize the religions and their sects as the most vicious and degenerate conspiracy theory ever since ancient times, makes a new insight and fact openly clear to me, namely that your statement shows terrifyingly clear that this religious sectarian, underhanded infiltration, the intellect and reason of the earth people can hardly be ended, but continues endlessly. This is because in humans religious sectarian piety acts like a drug that forms in the consciousness of every delusional believer as an epidemic, from which, as a result of his delusion of faith, a dullness against real reality and truth arises, which can no longer be recognized, and it is this dullness that no longer allows any intellectually rational thoughts, but rejects everything that is real, before it can even consciously reach consciousness.
And that is why the effect of this dullness, the inability that arises from it that rational thoughts can no longer be cultivated, is called stupidity.
Yes.
Then something else, if I remember correctly, then you don't have any political parties on error, like this bullshit exists on Earth. Can you explain to me how you manage to regulate everything in a world community?
You know that.
Yes, but I would like you to explain something about it so that I can call it up and write it down, so that the whole thing can then also be read by interested parties.
Of course, I see. And while I'm at it, I also want to mention what exactly was discussed in our committee and what proposal we came up with, which I should submit to you and all Figure Core Group members.
Yaha, interesting. But what is that supposed to be?
I will say what is necessary about this later, because now I want to answer your other question, the answer of which is not intended for you, because you are oriented about how our communal regulation results. So the following, which I want to point out and explain reasonably.
1.
Since the establishment of peace more than 50,000 years ago, we pledge ours no longer have any political parties among any of our peoples, either on Era or on any of our other worlds, as was previously the case. At that time, parties of all kinds were extensively banned from all Pleiadian governance provisions because they led to permanent discrepancies, As our state chronicles list, parties always required that through these requests and provisions with regard to any communal matters, laws as well as provisions, ordinances or any other necessities were discussed, negotiated and determined as well as effectively decreed and implemented, which, however, did not correspond to the will of the people due to disagreements. This resulted from various inaccuracies and deliberately brought about falsehoods in election proposals, which came about through lying and deceit of the population, because they were not cleared up according to the truth, but misled with false promises and explanations. In and with parties, their members through personal ideas, conceptions, personal wishes or desires, etc., of the party leaders' RISP. Party leaders are controlled, the party members recklessly, stupidly and simple-minded, follow the insidious whisperings of their party leadership, which are insidiously faked to them by lies and deceit, and this arises on the one hand as a result of the inability to think for themselves due to a lack of intellectual reasoning and the populations called to vote who are misled by their party leaders according to their wishes and willingly follow them. In addition, if it can come to that and the party leaders do not prevent it, motions and proposals as well as provisions etc., are talked to death by different views, opinions and nonsensical quarrels, which leads to emotional differences and arguments and thus to wrong decisions. This is because, as a rule, requests to vote submitted to the peoples are formulated imprecisely and in such a way that the voters cast their votes for a thing that is contrary to their understanding, as a result of corresponding underhand formulations, which means that the voters as a result of deliberately underhanded formulations ballot papers are misled and caused to vote against their understanding, and, as far as we know, this underhandedness often also arises on Earth, as is also the case at the present time with regard to
Framework Agreement,
based on lies and deceit, through which Switzerland and its people are underhandedly into the EU dictatorship and into their servitude should be driven.
2. Our knowledge and our knowledge, since the abolition of any party system more than 50,000 years ago, has shown that since then there have been no disputes, no political differences, no quarrels, dissatisfaction, no skirmishes, no peace disturbances, or any other inconsistencies in local, regional or state communal ways, as well as no more wrong decisions have arisen. Since then, no more planetary political dangers, uprisings, demonstrations, no wars or terrorism etc. have arisen, and not even in any way even hinted at, which, however, was often the case in earlier times, and a general unrest was constant, as our chronicles tell.
3.
Our exact and clear findings and our actions with regard to the suppression of any political parties, as such existed in earlier times more than 50,000 years ago, have proven, since their legal abolition, that parties existed earlier and just then.
A.
Political parties unreservedly and inevitably led to differences of opinion, disputes and quarrels as well as violence, dissatisfaction and communal political as well as private disagreements. Consequently, it can be clearly stated that political parties lead to erroneous and confused party imperial legislation, ordinances, prohibitions and regulations, through the constantly new and completely unnecessary as well as morally bad orders, directives, commands, decrees, commandments, instructions and edicts as well as new rights, injustices, misunderstandings of freedom and claims, as well as injustices, surveys, demands, duties, demands, approvals, permissions and privileges are created, as well as injunctions, authorizations, requirements, measures, duties, powers of attorney, powers, prohibitions and many other inconsistencies that lead to imperativism. Furthermore, Through a political party system, the moral laws and moral laws also become negative, categorically imperative or fundamentally determined in principle by unethical action, and decency and morality degraded to nothingness in a humane and shameful way, for example by declaring whoring by whore-freers to be legal open employment and taxing the proceeds of whoring services in order to shamelessly increase state revenues. Increase.
B.
Parties, political or apolitical, inevitably lead to differences, as among many others also with regard to ethnicization or origin of people, their appearance, skin color, eye color, language, body, morality, education or their lifestyle etc. To enmity and hatred, this xenophobic to an ethnic group or intuitive self-image oriented towards a certain definable social group of people is assigned to it, due to its sense of community as an in-group, as a certain identity as an ethnic group. This creates a hatred of religion and belief, as well as political racism or anti-racism, which spreads not only in the relevant political parties, but also in like-minded family and private areas, but also in certain groups of the population as well as in security groups and armies. Hateful activism, which inevitably spreads like a malicious epidemic, only to be expressed through corresponding hate speech, violent behavior, insults and acts up to murder, war and terror.
C.
With us pledgren there has been no party system for more than 50,000 years, but our entire population election determination process is geared towards our planetary or regional communal system, to our planet-wide communalization of electronic transmission in relation to the people's sovereignty as sovereign, who determines the state duties and public tasks for conversion, implementation into action for execution and implementation, according to which the communal administrators have the national community obligation incumbent on them, the electoral decisions put into practice by suitable forces etc. Basically, it must be defined repeatedly and explanatory that our entire electoral determination system is geared towards ensuring that all electoral facts that arise and are to be dealt with, originating on the one hand from the peoples and on the other hand from the state bodies, are thorough, detailed and understandable in a question and answer manner, is discussed, negotiated, explained, defined and decided on with the populations over the entire planetary expanse. All the facts that arise and that have been chosen for election will be made known to the populations of an incurred regional or whole pluric area 30 days before the election date via the corresponding remote communication areas. After that, the populations can then freely participate at the appropriate time in the electoral determination process, which is carried out in a detailed and enlightening manner over a whole day, on which all electoral determinants are openly discussed and clarified in detail in the question and answer process, and ultimately the electoral determination is made. Becomes
D.
Finally, it must be explained that our committee, which you know, like all people who gather in the Great Pyramid Hall, as you call our large meeting place, determine at advisory meetings which facts arise that are necessary to determine the election population should be brought forward. As you know, around 1.5 million people are present in the Pyramid Hall, who are made up of all walks of life and who fulfill this task according to their own free will and therefore do not determine, but correspond to voluntary members of the population who declare themselves ready to do so, and also at every consultation session composed of other people. The people who decide themselves to be MPs also exchange voluntarily with each other during the meetings, so that several people can give their opinion on a single matter. When at the end of the deliberations everything has been discussed and clarified in detail and unequivocally, which can possibly take several days, then the final act takes place, in which, as a rule, a unanimous vote takes place, which is then given to the populations in the manner mentioned for whose election determination is put forward.
That, Edward, is the most basic thing I have to say.
What you explained should be enough, thank you very much. Then a question. With you the committee has the function of providing advice to the peoples, explaining and arranging everything that is necessary and arising with regard to leadership, etc., as is the task of the rulers here on earth. As a rule, however, they are not in a position to do this because they are incapable of governing, and consequently they have to call in so-called
advisors,
such as lawyers, lobbyists, so-called government advisors, or
external experts on special assignments, etc., resulting in a tremendously expensive waste of money that the finance minister reluctantly has to shell out, whether he wants to or not.
This is because others cannot manage their finances, consequently they squander them and accumulate enormous national debts, because it is not their personal money and debts. What now in relation to the government advisor respectively, the alleged
external experts
for special assignments etc., is to be said, who sell the stupid rulers and the incapable of government and the like their advice at expensive prices and recommend what they should determine and do with regard to the business of government, state and people's leadership, etc. It costs taxpayers millions annually. In Germany alone they had to pay more than 1.2 billion euros for this last year. Last year, on February 4, 2019, the following was published at Volksstimme.de.
Ministry of Finance, 1.2 billion euros for government advisors since 2006. The federal government had spent at least 1.2 billion euros on more than 6,000 contracts with external advisors. The ministry's expenditures for external consultants are listed in statistics which, however, have large gaps.
Berlin, Ptaah. Since 2006, the federal government has spent at least 1.2 billion euros on more than 6,000 contracts with external consultants. That is the result of a survey by the Ministry of Finance at the Chancellery and the 14 federal ministries, which was carried out at the request of the left MP Matthias Hahn and is available to the German press agency. The Ministry of Finance itself reported the highest expenditures for external expertise with 258 million and the Interior Ministry with 208 million euros. At the bottom of the ranking are the Chancellery with 4.0 million and the Ministry of Health with 6.1 million euros. The Parliamentary State Secretary Bettina Hagedorn points out in her answer to the question that the figures are incomplete and not comparable. The main reason for this is that the relevant files only have to be kept for 5 years according to the applicable administrative regulations for the years up to 2014. Therefore, there would be in some cases no or only incomplete documents on the matters queried. In addition, the individual departments define differently what is meant by advisory and support services.
Extent of consultancy contracts unclear.
The actual extent of the use of external consultants by the federal government therefore remains unclear. The opposition criticizes that there are no reliable statistics on advisory services. The billions now mentioned by the Ministry of Finance is just the tip of the iceberg, said the left politician Hahn. The federal government uses all means and tricks to avoid disclosing the true costs of external advisory and support services. In any case, in the years from 2014 onwards, for which complete files still exist, the expenditure for external government consultants rose significantly. In 2014, according to the Ministry of Finance, they were still at 63 million euros. In 2015 it was already 105 million. In 2016 the number rose to 243 million and in 2017 it was 248 million euros. Not all ministries have reported figures for 2018. The involvement of business consultants and other external experts by the federal government is highly controversial. Critics believe that purchasing expertise is too expensive and, in view of the more than 20,000 employees in the ministries, not absolutely necessary. In addition, it is feared that it will have too great an impact on government work.
Committee of Inquiry decided.
The use of consultants in the Ministry of Defense will soon be reviewed by an investigative committee of the Bundestag. The Defense Committee passed a resolution to this effect last week. It is about allegations of incorrect procurement and nepotism. In the statistics of the Ministry of Finance, however, the Ministry of Defense appears relatively far below, with expenditure of €34 million since 2006 for advisory and support services including subordinate authorities. At the beginning of December, in another answer to a parliamentary question, the ministry had put the volume of the current framework and individual contracts at €207 million. In ZD Food, Politik, on January 31, 2020. 6:32 p.m. It was said, money for external expertise government advisors cost hundreds of millions of euros. External experts for special orders or an expensive waste of money. Opinions on government advisors vary widely. New figures on costs are fueling the discussion. Source: DPA. The German government spent more than €500 million on external consultants last year. According to the Finance Ministry, at the request of the left, the Chancellery and the 14 federal ministries have invested at least €548.5 million in external expertise. However, 5 departments have so far only reported the figures for one half year. Although the Ministry of Defense is one of them, it ranks first in the advisory rankings with expenses of €154.9 million for external experts. This is followed by the Ministry of the Interior with €152.4 million for the whole of 2019 and the Ministry of Transport with €110.6 million.
Allegations in consultant affair, von der Leyen's cell phone data, 1, 2. Away from Christina Hoffman.
The Chancellery, €537,000, only in the second half of the year. The Ministry of Education, €717,000, and the Ministry of Justice, €4 million, have bought the fewest additional expertise as things stand. However, State Secretary for Finance Bettina Hagedorn points out that there is no uniform definition in the individual ministries for external advisory and support services. Therefore, it cannot be assumed that the data will be comparable across departments, according to their answer, which is available to the German press agency. In addition, the figures should still be regarded as provisional.
Significant increase in spending since 2014.
The involvement of business consultants and other external experts by the federal government is highly controversial. Critics believe that purchasing expertise is too expensive and, in view of the more than 20,000 employees in the ministries, not absolutely necessary. In addition, it is feared that it will have too great an impact on government work. Proponents, on the other hand, promise added value in a wide variety of areas through an outside view or use experts for special tasks for which no permanent employees are required. For earlier years, the ministries had reported significantly lower consultant spending than they are now for 2019. In February last year, A similar survey by the Ministry of Finance showed that there was a significant increase between 2014 and 2017. In 2014, the government's advisory expenditure was €63 million. In 2015 it was already €105 million. In 2016 the number rose to €243 million. And in 2017 it was €248 million. At that time, no complete figures were available for 2018. The left-wing politician Matthias H.N. sharply criticizes the level of spending.
You can only shake your head.
He says, the federal government has thousands of competent civil servants in the ministries. First of all, they are there to do the substantive work for the government. Everything else makes a government dependent on private companies. That would be unacceptable.
Consultant affair in the Ministry of Defense overshadows the discussion. Matthias Hun, Die Link.
The FDP defense expert Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann has basically nothing to object to external consultants, but adds, however, if this happens in an uncontrolled manner, covered by the leadership of the ministry, and calls for tenders are illegally passed on by hand not to accept that. She is alluding to the Bundestag Committee of Inquiry, which is currently investigating the consultant affair about the use of consultants in the Ministry of Defense. It is about allegations of incorrect procurement and nepotism. In mid-February, the former defense minister and current EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen will be questioned by the committee. Transport Minister Andreas Scheuer, CSU, was criticized for the use of consultants in matters of car tolls and is now again spending large sums of money on building a central federal motorway administration.
I can't remember is probably the most frequently said sentence that ex-Secretary of State Suda says in the EU Committee on the Advisor affair. A performance with flavors. Digitization, as a justification for external expertise. Date: the 30th of January 2020. All three leaders in the consultant rankings, the Ministries of Defense, Interior Affairs and Transport, defended the purchase of external expertise on Friday. The Ministry of Defense pointed out that the IT service provider BOA alone accounts for €109 million, which looks after the 1,200 Bundeswehr properties. The ministry had already stated earlier that the need for action on digitization went beyond the Bundeswehr's own personnel capacities, both in terms of quantity and quality. A spokesman for the Interior Ministry said that the external consultants would be deployed on a project-by-project basis and that they would also take on overarching tasks for the entire federal government. And the Ministry of Transport emphasized that some tasks could hardly be completed on time without external experts. As an example, he named the structure of the motorway administration. Source: Michael Fisher, Ptaah. And for that, the tax-paying populations have to pay millions every year, because the rulers as government leaders are absolutely hollow nuts, rivets and zeros and do not understand anything about the tasks that they would have to perform as national leaders. That is also the case in Switzerland, although I only see the finance minister who can do his job independently, who actually knows how to do it, and he does it properly. But through the rivets and zeros in the government, which also includes those figures in the Council of States and National Council who in turn function around in various parties, their blind stupid nonsense torpedoed and destroys his good work again. For example, by his millions of budget savings are again wasted pointlessly, stupidly. And it is precisely for this purpose, just as an example of many other government idiocies, horrific amounts of millions are paid and squandered, precisely on government advisors who, in addition to
technical advice,
also devise and suggest all sorts of other nonsensicals that are picked up by unfit government officials and put into stupid ways. And such nonsense is effectively advocated and carried out by those in power who are incapable of government, to the detriment of all taxpayers and those who have done a good job in the area of state finance administration, such as the finance minister of Switzerland, who then inadvertently forfeits his high-value state budget savings as a result of the boundless stupidity of others and nonsense spending of others' risp. Idiots have to shell out, for which he is then unjustifiably insulted and pissed off by other idiots, such as clerks in public organs. Unsuitable rulers are not only loud-mouthed in Germany and in all other countries on earth, but also in Switzerland, and there, too, in my home country, there are shameful things that are not fair to the people's leadership and do not agree with everything that is fundamental would have to be in Swiss, above all the betrayal of the homeland, which can even be described as treason, who want to sell our homeland to the EU dictatorship, in which the Lisbon Treaty introduced the death penalty. 40 Also in the event of a case would be used for the feeble-minded who want to sell our homeland to this despotism union. So the EU is opening a back door to the death penalty, as I said earlier when this matter was discussed in 2009. The underhanded EU constitution allows the death penalty and killings by the military and security agencies, as well as executions in the event of insurrection or riot, demonstration and unrest. Believe me, for my part, I think that all the power-hungry members of the EU dictatorship know very well that parts of the populations of the states belonging to it do not allow themselves to be fooled forever, and that sooner or later they will oppose the dictatorship. Fight back will begin. So the EU dictatorship powers have, I think, roaring and cowardly fear that they will be hurt by riots and unrest, as you mentioned on April 5th. Not in this way, but in a different way. And the hammer of the EU dictatorship pre-introducing the death penalty is that the EU dictatorship parliamentary gang, which has to vote on laws and regulations, generally doesn't even know what the EU dictatorship top dictators are actually bring to the vote. I found the following on the internet, posted by Honigman on April 11, 2009 in Politics. What many do not know, and most of all the members of the parliaments of the EU states, because, according to their own statements, they have never read the text in detail. We have but no time to read laws we are voting on. We are relying on a summary of the government experts, is that with the Lisbon Treaty the death penalty can be carried out under certain circumstances. Professor Schneider points out that the Lisbon Treaty, among other things, can reintroduce the death penalty, which every EU citizen should know.
That is probably not expressly stated in the text of the contract, but hidden in a footnote that says,
except in the case of war, uprising or riot.
Then the death penalty is possible. Schneider points out that this fact is scandalous, because they have built this possibility into a footnote of a footnote, and you have to read it carefully and be an expert to interpret it correctly. Well, what I want to say further is, even the majority of those in power in Switzerland are not the golden in the egg for effective state and popular leadership, because they too live in a madness, right down to the majority of political members, that there is always a new ordinance, a new law, regulation, rule or prohibition, etc. had to be created. Delusional ideas and the like are the order of the day, in order to perpetuate themselves by loud-mouthing and nonsensical speeches with their own name and any kind of nonsense that restricts their freedom, because there is no other way for these poor lunatics to raise even a tiny iota of their inferior self-esteem. And these figures also belong to those who hire consultants and government advisors at the expense of the taxpayers, so-called
external experts for special orders,
etc. Also in Switzerland, whereby the money for the payment of these
external consultants
is passed through to the people, taxes are stolen, and then inevitably huge tax monies have to be spent by the Ministry of Finance, which is a heavy burden on the federal treasury. And in order to relieve this burden again, the inevitable rule that the whole thing is shifted onto the shoulders of the taxpayers until they are hurt by the sheer taxpayers has to lie in debt again follows. Of course, there are also countercurrents in the politics of sensible politicians against this nonsense, but despite constant political pressure, the unsuitable rulers are neither fired from their offices nor replaced by capable persons capable of governing. Just as the nonsense of government advisory is neither prohibited nor abolished. As a result, the costs of the Swiss Confederation for this external advisory service regarding incapacitated rulers will not decrease. And that also showed that Switzerland, which last year paid 769 million Swiss francs for such
services
from private providers for external government advisors in relation to this administrative nonsense, is squandering taxpayers' money, but the taxpayers are probably squandering about the stupidity of the incompetent rulers. Shrun's laugh in the stomach. Then I have another question, namely whether you have found out and now know the name of the Ischweiss who was assigned to Jmanuel?
Yes, I know that now. It was Helion, whose name means
the sun-like radiant one.
Thank you. Then the following question, how is it actually with you on Erra and on all other planets? Do the people of the Pledges have lethal weapons at all privately? And what about the military, armies and security forces etc. regarding lethal weapons etc.? The case on Earth is such, especially in the USA, that all gun-crazy people are legally allowed to have deadly shooting clubs of all kinds. Even small children from 4U circumflex 6 years of age are allowed to use small-caliber weapons that can be used against people and for to educate killing. This in the delusional and murderous sense of simply shooting people down when they should feel threatened or something, regardless of whether there is a threat to life or not. There are also other states in which private individuals also have lethal weapons. But by this I do not mean knives or swords, bows and arrows, crossbows, lances, spears and the like, but effectively short, small and long weapons, respectively.
Shooting stick,
which are provided with cartridges, which then fire projectiles when the trigger is pulled through and the firing pin strikes the bottom of the cartridge and triggers the explosion, which drives the projectile out of the barrel, then through the air at high speed and dash to the finish.
You know something about this subject, because as a result of your various activities you also had to carry and handle firearms, which is why you could explain a few things to me. I am thinking about the airspeed etc. of the projectiles. What would be of interest to me and what you can possibly tell me a few things.
I know some things, but it's not much. But if that's enough for you, can I tell you something about the rate of fire of live weapons? For example?
Yes, I care.
Fine, then I'll start with what I still know, which is really not much anymore. It was a long time ago, probably more than 30 years, when I was still blasting around and also dealt with the firing speed of the various weapons and with them and with the shooting itself.
You are a very exceptionally good marksman, both with long guns and especially with pistols and revolvers, as my daughter Semjes told me. That was necessary, however, because you were dependent on it because of your various activities in different countries and also in Switzerland. Because you also had to have a so-called
weapon carrier.
As you showed me one in 1987 because I wanted to see one.
Yes, I remember that. You took a photo of the slip because you wanted to archive it, if I remember correctly. About the shooting, what Sam Jace told you, that wasn't that bad. It was just practice, and it was a long time ago. I still have, but that is not important and not even what you want to know. So, then I want to start with the rate of fire with the air rifles, because these have
air rifles. I am not aware of this. What does that mean?
Air rifles are small caliber rifles, RUSP. Rifles that run on either compressed air or gas. Pure air rifles have a small compressed air moment, which creates compressed air through which a small bullet can be fired. Other similar air rifles can be used in the same way with small gas cartridges. The smallest bullets have a caliber of 4.5 mm, which reach a rate of fire of around 175 meters per second, while larger air rifles with a caliber of approximately 5.5 mm have a rate of fire of, if I remember correctly, around 243 meters per second.
After the air rifles, there are small caliber cartridge rifles, which are also called small bore rifles and have rim detonator cartridges, which means that there is a percussion fuse powder in the bottom of the cartridge, which the hammer or fuse strikes, igniting the cartridge powder and causing the cartridge shell to explode as thrown out of the cartridge case and chases through the gun barrel into the open and then straight into the targeted target.
Interesting. I would like to know and learn more about this later.
You can, of course, but there is still a lot more to be said about the firing speed while we're at it, because larger guns naturally have larger caliber cartridges, which means that more immense drives are created by the explosion of the cartridge explosives. To explain the whole thing in this regard, however, would lead too far, so I will only go into it briefly at the moment and say and explain a few other things. I can explain more to you on another occasion. So now this, you are familiar with pistols, revolvers and rifles, and I can explain that these of course have different cartridge calibers, the bullets of which have correspondingly different bullet speeds, which, as is usual, I specify in meters per second, which is abbreviated to ms. Then the following for these weapons, which I can show you later with pictures on the internet.
9 Probellum equals pistol 340 meters, s. 45 ACP equals automatic Colt pistol 240 meters, s. 308 Winchester equals rifle 870 meters, s. 223 Remington equals rifle 950 meters, s. The fastest bullet I know is that of the 17 Remington cartridge with around 1,250 meters, s.
That's enough for today, thank you.
Okay, too, but it would be interesting for me to know what you know about the private arming of the Earthlings, because your father Sfath was already concerned with finding out how many weapons the Earthlings are privately owned. I would be interested in that and ask you if you know the dates for it.
No, but I can call it up if you really care.
Yes, I am interested, and it would also be interesting to know how the number of weapons is in relation to the number of inhabitants, at least in the USA, whose private arsenal is really excessive. I am thinking particularly of the USA, where a large part of the population has succumbed to a catastrophic gun mania, which is criminally promoted by the gun lobby and is still idiotic and irresponsible, promoted by the crazy and pathologically stupid US presidential clown Trump, to the gun supporters on his side in the election of the new presidency. I would also be interested in which date are to be calculated for Switzerland.
I can give you information about such dates, because they are contained in our monthly records, so I can call them up for the month of August. And what you say about Trump and the gun lobby is actually correct.
Okay, please, thank you.
It just takes a while, yes. See.
Ptaah, you're good, That's no use to me, because I can't decipher that, because for me they are bohemian villages.
Of course, how can I? Well then, if, as I see here, I put the number of weapons that appear here in relation to the number of inhabitants, then it follows that in the United States of America there are many more weapons in the private sector than the U.S. population and residents. In the U.S., my device records 7 guns per person here, and it also states that the total population of all states in the U.S. was 334.46 million at the end of August, more than 6 million more than the U.S. Census at the end of 2019. This majority results from all the illegal persons from other countries around the world who have immigrated to the USA and live in the country as illegals without being recognized. And as far as private gun ownership in the United States of America is concerned, the situation with regard to the handling of firearms by criminal and criminal elements is becoming more and more extreme, as are women and men stricken with fear who are willing to kill people without hesitation, even if they think they are being threatened without justification.
That corresponds to the perfect US-American miserable order, as the United States wields through its world war terror in many countries, where they act as world police, invade foreign states and bring them under their power. But now you could see what Switzerland is up to regarding private gun ownership. Please.
As I can see here, Switzerland has had a population of around 8.6 million since the end of August, of which, according to our records, a little less than 1/3 RISP, approximately 2.86 million of the total population of the country are privately in possession of various types of firearms. Contrary to the USA, however, it should be explained that in Switzerland, in contrast to the United States, where there is immense crime and many murders with firearms are the order of the day, as you say, with regard to private weapon possession and use of weapons, despite liberal law strict order prevails and gun abuse is rare.
My home is really a land of freedom and democracy, which cannot be said of any other state on earth, but which all those idiots cannot understand, especially those horny oxen and horned cows in the Bundestag, National Council and Council of States, and not in those parties and in the young politicians groups who, as traitors, want to sell Switzerland to the EU dictatorship. Well, as far as private gun ownership in Switzerland is concerned, you can see various things on the internet here, some of which I will quote. Look here, in this regard no comparison can be made with the USA, where the gun lobby exercises its power irresponsibly and even allows children and other minors to use and teach guns to fire. And this is also promoted by the absolute irresponsibility of the parents in that they buy their children weapons and teach them how to use them and possibly kill people. Something of this kind cannot gain a foothold in Switzerland, although we have a very liberal weapons law, because we have order in this regard, and the Swiss of both sexes have a sense of responsibility that is perceived and lived. If the Swiss weapons legislation is examined, it is one of the most liberal in the world, because the possession and acquisition of weapons and ammunition are fundamentally permitted to all innocent citizens, provided that the law does not contain any special provisions that prohibit the acquisition of weapons. A firearm can only be acquired in Switzerland by people who can present a good certificate of repute and an honest extract from the criminal record. But now back to what you want to know, whereby I also want to mention small arms, so that you know that there are also such and what is meant by them. These weapons are small handguns such as revolvers and pistols that can be carried and operated by a single person, open or hidden.
That is all very interesting what you explain, and of course the whole subject is very broad.
That is actually the case, and you can read a lot about it on the internet. For example, as you can see this here, what I have just picked out. If you are interested.
Yes.
Good. Then you can read for yourself. But I would also like to say that the Swiss population voted on changes to the Weapons Act. According to statistics, there were around 2.3 million small arms in this country up until then that were in civilian possession, but according to your findings your information is more than that. But what needs to be said about the vote, you can read here on the net.
The new weapons ordinance has been in force since August 15. For the purchase of an assault rifle 90 or 57 with a magazine of more than 10 cartridges, an exemption is now required.
After the lost vote against the Weapons Act of May 19, the federal government put the new law, which had been amended on the basis of the EU Weapons Directive, into force on August 15. Since then, the new weapons ordinance has been in force, which regulates the acquisition and possession of semi-automatic weapons, which from now on are basically prohibited weapons: assault rifles 90 and 57 with a magazine of more than 10 cartridges, as well as semi-automatic pistols with a magazine of more than 20 cartridges can now only be purchased with a special permit. Anyone in possession of such a weapon that has not yet been registered in a cantonal weapons register has 3 years to report the weapon. Fedpol has put the form for the exemption and a form for proof of regular shooting online on its website. In addition, various questions about the new weapons ordinance are answered. The weapons ordinance will be presented in detail in the next Members magazine. Siasen Schweiz, Joe Ilfili, lawyer and master rifleman, has analyzed the gun ordinance and its effects on shooters. He kindly made his analysis available. It can be downloaded here.
Thank you. Then I will now read what you have picked out here, but I can see right here that this internet information is not correct and consequently does not agree with our findings. With the absolute number of weapons, the USA stands out, and the situation seems to be getting worse and worse. In the period from 2006 to 2017 alone, the Americans purchased and imported at least 122 million new weapons. Data source: the data set for the article comes from the Small Arms Survey of the Geneva Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. An international team of experts compiles an annual report on the topic. The authors assume that of the roughly 1 billion small arms that exist worldwide, a good 850 million, that is 85%, are in private hands. The remaining weapons are owned by the military, around 13%, or law enforcement, 2%. If you put the numbers in relation to the number of inhabitants, one thing becomes clear: in the United States there are more private weapons than people. In second place is Yemen, where every second inhabitant still has a small weapon, although there is also war there.
USA, 120.5 guns per 100 population. Yemen, 52.8 weapons per 100 inhabitants. Montenegro, 39.1 weapons per 100 inhabitants. Serbia, 39.1 weapons per 100 inhabitants. Canada, 34.7 guns per 100 population. Switzerland is further ahead here, with 27.6 weapons per 100 inhabitants. We are in 16th place. Only countries with more than 150,000 inhabitants are included in the above ranking. Data for all recorded regions can be seen on the map. Among the 10 countries that are most heavily armed are 5 European ones. Switzerland ranks 34th in the global ranking. Around 850 million small arms are owned by private individuals around the world. The most armed countries militarily: USA, 393.3 million weapons; India, 71.1 million weapons; China, 49.7 million weapons; Pakistan, 43.9 million weapons; Russia, 17.6 million weapons; Brazil, 17.55 million weapons; Mexico, 16.8 million weapons.
These data do not correspond to the actual facts compared to our findings, because all these values listed here are given a lot lower than what corresponds to the correctness and truth, according to our very precise investigations and records.
That will probably be so, because as I know our earthlings, people everywhere and with everything and everyone are hairdressed, cheated, faked and lied to. In my opinion, this also applies to what applies to the instrumentalization of children with murderous instruments, since the unscrupulous parents buy the teenage children weapons and teach them to shoot, with the advice to shoot at people when the opportunity arises and to transport them to the afterlife.
I am informed about that, yes. And what is done and allowed in this regard in U.S. America corresponds not only to criminal but also to criminal activity, because through this, even small children and young people are effectively trained to become instruments of murder, and this criminal behavior is irresponsibly not only tolerated but even encouraged by criminal legislation and the affirmation of the government. This is just as reprehensible and aimed at a contempt for human life as the whole behavior of the parents themselves, many adults as well as many security forces and the entire military. On the other hand, the minority of righteous Americans of both sexes cannot address and do nothing, because in the USA too the evil, the consistently degenerate and inhumane are just as much and much more depraved than in any other so-called civilized country. What is done in the USA with regard to fear, cowardice and contempt for human life under the guise of alleged self-protection, not only with the children, but in general, is only aimed at the violent, ruthless and irresponsible criminal killing and murdering of fellow human beings. And that with such acts the reason is often vengeance and retribution, after which the murders are justified as self-defense and the murderers are acquitted. This effectively shows the depravity of these earthly people, just as this applies to any legislation that involves the death penalty speaks state injustice and order state murder, and state murder is also committed by every executioner when he carries out death sentences. Just as murders are committed en masse by the military of all armies when acts of war or insurrection take place, which has nothing to do with self-defense, self-protection or state protection, etc. Effectively, through state-ordered wars and acts of terrorism, criminally ordered, dehumanized, legalized and merciless, violent and ruthlessly barbaric murders are committed, for which the guilty state leaders issue the orders and send entire armies to their deaths while they themselves crouch in safety and for their crimes not to be held accountable. Every soldier or security person ordered by the state to shoot and kill people, be it in relation to security, insurrection or war, etc., becomes an effective murderer just as every executioner when an order to kill is carried out. Those who issue such orders must also be convicted as murderers, be they state authorities or law judges. In this sense, parents are also potential murderers who encourage their children to kill people with firearms or other instruments suitable for murder, etc., when their children then actually kill people, regardless of whether they are then children or already adults are. As for your direct question about weapons with us pledge ours, RISP, whether we pledge ours have privately owned weapons, I can explain that this is just as not the case, as we have no military weapons or any instruments, etc., which are designed to kill people. We are only equipped with effective defense instruments that are manufactured in such a way that they do not cause kills, but only temporary incapacitation of humans or other living beings of all genres and species, without their health being impaired in any way or even physically and organically harmed.
Thank you. That's enough of an explanation for me. Then I have another question relating to Putin, who is in no way defending himself against the attacks of the evil Navalny. I also find it strange that this Navalny with his hate speech is not stopped in the West.
For the entire West, as you say, The hate speech that he is conducting against Putin and the Russian government in general comes in extremely handy, especially the German incompetent Chancellor Merkel, her supporters, but also the entire EU dictatorship, like you call this European disaster, like the United States of America, have fallen into the delusion that they could benefit from it and bring Putin and Russia under their mania for dictatorship. As a self-proclaimed enemy of Putin and government enemy of Russia, Navalny is a welcome object for the entire Western states to profit from his hate speech. Navalny's lust for power, who hopes to fill his own greed for power in the West through his hate speech against Putin and to move into Moscow as Russian head of state, is limitless.
That he outwardly veils his true, maliciously shaped character and presents himself differently than he really is, that corresponds to how that was characteristic of all similar people who have managed to come to state power from time immemorial in order to thereafter 1,000 and bring millions of calamities to their peoples or the whole world. Unfortunately, it is as it always was, namely that such power-hungry elements like this Navalny, through their lies, slander and promises of lies etc. A lot of influx of completely inexperienced, stupid and incapable of judgment followers respectively. Followers, and, as I often say, stupid footfolk, turn necks, yes-men and opportunists, who always align their opinions like a weather vane flutters according to the wind direction. There is nothing more to say, except perhaps that the true malevolent being of this man Navalny is written openly on his face, which, however, is not seen and not recognized by all those earthlings who do not care about the ability of character recognition in the try to use physiognomy and consequently do not recognize any character traits or can't read out. But this only applies to simple and uneducated people, which in my opinion is understandable because the so-called
normal person
does not deal with psychology, etc. What is regrettable, however, relates to the fact that very often people who scold themselves as psychological
specialists,
etc., also think they are physiognomy interpreters etc., although they are utterly riveted in this. If Navalny actually came to power in Russia, disaster would spread over time, as was the case with Stalin, Hitler and many other despots. When such elements actually come to the government, they first act as good rulers who are close to the people and then, when they have found their way in the government saddle, slowly transform into dictators and slowly harass the peoples and wreak havoc.
What you say is indeed true, and as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, who is misjudged by all his enemies and his serenity and calm misinterpreted, in the near future he will at least bring himself to demand evidence that Navalny is indeed with him. Neurotoxin Novikov is said to have been poisoned. In fact, there is no evidence whatsoever that traces of Novikov were found near Navalny, because on the one hand no Novikov residues were found in the first immediate and very thorough examinations after the hospital admission in the Siberian city of Tomsk near Navalny, when you asked us to determine whether there was actually something at play with Novikov there. In fact, there was no evidence of a crime against Alexei Navalny, as we checked later when our interest in it was piqued. We also checked his dormitory, but we couldn't find any traces of the poison, nor did we find any dozen of objects belonging to him, strangers or the inn. What we find extremely strange and suspicious is the fact that after his collapse, which also seems very strange to us, Navalny was flown so quickly and easily to the west of Germany and taken to the Berlin University Hospital, where numerous tests and examinations were carried out at Navalny whose truthful results are kept secret. And these strange things continued to arise when Novikov is said to have suddenly been discovered, which was not the case with detailed investigations in Tomsk, but is said to have been the case several times in Germany with new investigations, which we are concerned about after our first investigations in Tomsk no longer care deeply. but only superficially, until today. What we do know, however, corresponds to extremely unpleasant inconsistencies that relate to background machinations that should not be mentioned openly, namely, the German government withholds various information and insists on secrecy about the matter of Alexei Navalny, who is vehemently and maliciously in deep hatred as Putin and Kremlin critics and does not ignore any underhandedness in order to make Putin impossible in order to gain control of the state himself. The German leaders, especially Chancellor Merkel, are now keeping the results of the diagnosis on Alexei Navalny a secret. This also applies to Russia, although the Russian Public Prosecutor's Office has asked for a legal aid and the release of the investigation results in order to be able to conduct its own investigations. But that is what the German leadership wants to prevent, especially Chancellor Merkel.
And next?
We do not deal with it any further, because on the one hand it is a matter in which we are in no way interested because according to our directives we are not allowed to interfere in such matters, and on the other hand we have only tried to get some information for a short time because you asked us about it as a result.
Anyway, thank you very much for your effort. For what? But that's something to keep quiet.
And you understand that well. Which reminds me of what I read in my father's annals when you said something in 1947, at the age of 10, when he asked you to remain silent about certain things, facts and things.
So what was that I said? I don't remember that anymore.
Your words, which my father wrote down, were,
"Only rarely can I find words and say something that is more and more important than silence. So I keep to silence."
Then another question, maybe a few others too, if you still have time to answer them, because it's getting late by now.
There is no rush today. So if you have any further questions then.
Okay, thank you. Then the following, you know that here on Earth there are permanent and idiotic demonstrations being carried out for any idiocy, which the demonstrators usually either understand absolutely nothing and therefore do not know their actual facts and causes, etc., such as, for example, the stupid climate freaks of their
Fridays for Future
movement, etc. But also many others who demonstrate for other things and have no idea why they really go on the streets and organize terror. If a demonstration for or against something that has to be recognized as justified is demonstrated with sense, understanding and reason, then there is probably nothing wrong with it. If violence, terror, murder, manslaughter and destruction etc. are not included. But that's not what I want to ask, but whether demonstrations are even known to you on error or to you pledgers.
In all of our Pleiadian planetary realms, demonstrations of how such are carried out on Earth are absolutely unknown because there are no justifications that could lead to such behavior. As you know, all concerns of every single person are regulated in depth by our committee, which in the chair, together with around 1.5 million voluntary representatives of the people and in the presence of the person concerned, clarifies everything and therefore never remains unresolved. As a result, nothing arises from such discussions, clarifications, determinations and negotiations that cannot be clarified to the satisfaction of the person, group of people or a national community, etc. If such negotiations and clarifications etc. are carried out by all participants to the satisfaction of a single person, a community or population need to be clarified.
I know that and I've already seen it with your father's Sfath. I also know that such an event occurs only very rarely and hardly once.
That's right.
Exactly, I said. Then there is this, when I am now asking questions, our super clever, just all the earthlings who boast of teacher, doctor and professor titles, as well as others who like to shine and want to distinguish themselves as great knowledgeable and wise men, by reciting proverbs, words, expressions and wisdom of old thinkers. What do you think is of the more to think of these people?
The citing of old wisdom. If it is about sayings, aphorisms and life wisdom, then these are very valuable and instructive, which otherwise does not apply to quotations that serve to reinforce any explanations, statements and claims, etc. That a statement etc. should be confirmed and confirmed. The citing of wisdom risp. Sayings, aphorisms and wisdom show valuable ways and behaviors that can be used in an evolutionary, progressive and instructive way for the better and for success. Quotations are the opposite of this, because a quotation is based on a purely coordinating statement with regard to a specific topic, repeating such a statement in different ways on other topics, respectively. Weaving into a certain other topic is nonsensical and is aimed solely at making the speaker who is bringing the quotation appear well-read, educated, important and intelligent.
Such kind of people are many, and usually it is some kind of person who corresponds to such.
Smart.
But who usually have a philosophical background or an opinion, etc., that they are something like high-born. And with that, Ptaah, dear friend, is it now late and probably time for us to go our way again, unless you too have something to say or explain?
No, but today's conversation was particularly informative for me and has brought me a lot of new and previously unknown information that has given me new insights.
Fine, I'll shut down my office and go to sleep.
Good, then goodbye, Edward. You need to rest.
I think. Bye, Ptaah.